Hello, I'm Ryan Stitt, and welcome back to the History of Ancient Greece, episode 112, the Korinthian War. Where we last left off, in 396 BC, the Spartan king Agesilaus II had led an expeditionary force to the western coast of Asia Minor in order to support the Asiatic Greeks against Tissaphernes, the Persian satrap of Lydia and Caria. In total, he had about 15,300 men at his disposal, more than double what Thibron and Dercylidus, the previous Spartan commanders in Asia Minor, each commanded. For the first time, a Spartan general was leading troops sufficient enough for a major Asian campaign, though nowhere near enough to accomplish the Spartan goal of liberating the Asiatic Greeks. However, Agesilaus did not immediately attack Tissaphernes. Instead, he first took the fight to Hellespontine Phrygia, the dominion of another Persian satrap, Pharnabazus. He achieved very little there and spent the winter of 396-395 BC at Ephesus, preparing his army, both in resources and in training, for a major campaign the following spring. As the spring of 395 BC came, Agesilaus let it be known that his next target would be the rich land around the Lydian capital city of Sardis. This was not a Greek city and was roughly 50 miles or 75 kilometers from the coastline. So was his intent no longer to just liberate the Greek cities from Persian control, but now to conquer Persian territory for Sparta? Or was he just trying to play mind games with Tissaphernes once again? Well, Tissaphernes at least believed that the announcement was a ruse, because if Agesilaus really intended to attack Sardis, he would not have said so, and thus give away his strategy. Instead, Tissaphernes anticipated that Agesilaus would finally attack Caria this time, so he once again concentrated his troops in that area. But Agesilaus had not lied, and so he led his men not south, but northeast, where, for 3 days, they successfully ravaged the land on their way to Sardis, just as he said that he would. Agesilaus couldn't take Sardis itself, as it was heavily fortified, so he plundered its surrounding neighborhoods. It wasn't until the third day that Tissaphernes finally realized that Agesilaus had spoken the truth about his intentions, at which point he mobilized his cavalry and chased in pursuit. The reason for the delay likely had to do with the geography of Western Asia Minor, which has a number of river valleys separated by mountain ranges running east to west. If you spread the fingers of one hand and imagine that the fingers are the mountain ranges and the spaces between them are the river valleys, you'll get the picture. These mountain ranges not only made it difficult for the Persians to shift forces quickly from one area to another, but also to have a clear picture of where the enemy forces were currently located. When Tissaphernes and his forces finally reached Sardis, they found Agesilaus' troops plundering the area on the eastern bank of the Pactolus River, on the city's northern outskirts. They also noticed that the Greeks were scattered over the plain, and so they crossed the river and set up camp while the cavalry attacked the Greek foragers, who were further to the east, and killed many of them. In response, Agesilaus ordered his own cavalry to ride to their aid, causing the Persian commander to form up his horsemen for battle. At the same time, realizing that the Persians did not bring infantry with them, Agesilaus drew up his foot soldiers into formation and led them to join up with his cavalry against the enemy's cavalry. Xenophon says that he ordered the hoplites from the 10-year class, meaning those who were serving their first decade of service, from the age of 20 to 29, to engage the enemy first, while the peltasts were to lead the way at a run. He also gave the order for his cavalry to attack. Even though the Persians stoutly met the attack of the Spartan cavalry, eventually the multi-pronged attack proved too much, and they could not withstand the onslaught of the entire army. Some fell in their ranks, and others in the bed of the Pactolus. The rest fled. Agesilaus pursued them as far as their camp, which he captured and plundered. It yielded immense booty, including 70 talents of silver and an unspecified number of camels, something which Agesilaus evidently became known for when he brought them back to Greece. Unable to take the city, Agesilaus then pillaged its northwestern suburbs. This telling was found in Xenophon, but Diodorus and the Oxyrhynchus historian provide a different account of this battle. According to them, Tissaphernes gathered 10,000 cavalrymen and 50,000 infantrymen and pursued the enemy. Agesilaus formed his soldiers in a square and clung to the foothills of Mount Sipylus, awaiting a favorable opportunity to attack the enemy. He overran the countryside as far as Sardis before turning back. That night, when he was midway between Sardis and nearby Thymbrara, he dispatched one of his Spartate officers, Xenocles, with a force of 1,400 men to a thickly wooded place to set an ambush. Then, Agesilaus himself moved at daybreak along the way with his army. When he had passed the place of ambush, and the Persians were advancing upon him without battle order and harassing his rearguard, he suddenly turned about his men to the Persians' surprise. When a sharp battle followed, he raised the signal to the soldiers in the ambush, and chanting the battle song, they charged the enemy. The Persians turned at once in flight after seeing that they were caught between two forces. Pursuing them for some distance, Agesilaus' men slew over 6,000 of them, gathered a great many more as prisoners, and pillaged their camp. His own casualties were 600. Tissaphernes, struck at the Spartan daring, withdrew from the battle to Sardis, and Agesilaus was about to attack the satrapies farther inland, but led his army back to the sea when he could not obtain favorable omens from the sacrifices. Whatever the case, this incident meant little more than a skirmish, and was hardly one of any great military importance. But it did produce one significant political effect, as it brought the fall of Tissaphernes. When the Persian king, Artaxerxes II, learned of his defeats, he grew angry at him, since he considered him to be the one responsible for the war in the first place. Artaxerxes also yielded to the queen mother, Parysatis, who hated Tissaphernes as the principal cause of the death of her favorite son Cyrus. Therefore, he dispatched his Hazarapatish, or commander of the 1,000-strong imperial guard, a man named Tithrastus, to execute Tissaphernes. He also ordered Ariaeus to help in the plot. Nothing is known of Tithrastus before this event, but if you remember from episode 110, Ariaeus fought alongside Cyrus at Cunaxa before flipping over to Tissaphernes' side during the retreat, which likely gained him post-war immunity from Artaxerxes. In any case, it seems that he and Tissaphernes maintained friendly relations, because when Ariaeus invited him to his residence at Colossae in Phrygia to discuss important business matters, Tissaphernes was unsuspicious and even left behind his personal bodyguard. When he arrived, he set aside his sword and went into a bath, presumably to clean himself after his travels before they discussed any business. While naked, Ariaeus' men seized him and sent him to Tithrastus by a covered carriage in order to conceal the plot. Tithrastus, or one of his men, soon beheaded Tissaphernes, and his head was sent to Artaxerxes as proof. Following the death of Tissaphernes, Tithrastus replaced him as the satrap of Lydia. However, perhaps as early as 395 BC, but definitely no later than 390 BC, a man named Hecatomnus became the first satrap of Caria, which was until then part of other satrapies, usually that of Lydia. Hecatomnus was also the first non-Persian official to be elevated to the position of satrap. It is likely that Hecatomnus had been a supporter of Tissaphernes and might have been employed by him in some subordinate office, which is what allowed him to rise to prominence in local politics and in Artaxerxes' eyes. In any case, while still under the umbrella of the Achaemenid Empire, the indigenous Carian dynasty of the Hecatomnidae ruled with considerable autonomy as a hereditary dynasty from around 395 to 300 BC. His family traditionally held power in the city of Mylassa, and so, with his ascension, he moved the satrapy's capital there. As for Tithrastus, as the new satrap of Lydia, he sent word to Agesilaus that he would agree to give autonomy to the Asiatic Greek cities if they would continue to pay the tribute that they historically had done so before. Basically, they could govern themselves however they wished, so long as they paid their taxes. In response, Agesilaus said that he could not accept these terms without authorization from home, and asked for him to consult with the authorities in Sparta. He spoke the truth, but he also had no real idea what his next step would be. He found himself back on the coast at Ephesus, no closer to success than either Thibron or Deicylidus had been. On top of that, he now had fewer resources. Ultimately, this led him to strike a bargain that perfectly suited Tithrastus. They agreed to a 6-month truce, and during that time, so that his men weren't idle, Agesilaus would invade Phrygia again and attack the land of Pharnabazus, for which he would receive 30 talents from Tithrastus to cover his expenses. The broader significance of this truce for the satrap was that he was able to buy time to prepare the counterstrike that would drive the Spartans entirely out of Asia, more on that shortly, while simultaneously reducing his rival satrap. Therefore, Agesilaus began his march northward, but along the way, word arrived from Sparta that he was also to be commander of the navy. This dual command of both the army and the navy was an honor that Plutarch records had not been given to any other Spartan king beforehand. Feeling empowered, Agesilaus then quickly ordered the cities on the coast and the islands to prepare 120 triremes for his use, and made admiral his inexperienced brother-in-law, Pysandros, over other more competent men. The messengers also agreed that Agesilaus should ignore Tithrastus' ultimatum and reaffirmed their resolve to liberate the Asiatic Greeks. So Pysandros departed and began to attend to naval matters, while Agesilaus and the army continued on to Phrygia. News of the Spartan naval buildup, combined with the slowness of the Cilicians and the Phoenicians to reach their quota, caused concern for Conon, the exiled Athenian who was currently serving as commander of the Persian fleet. Messages back and forth weren't doing the trick, so at some point in 395 BC, Conon left his fleet and traveled to Babylon to take his grievances directly to Artaxerxes' court. Standing before the Persian king, he promised to destroy the Spartans' naval power, but argued that this would only be possible with full financial support and strategic autonomy. What he specifically said is not recorded, but it must have been pleasing to Artaxerxes because he honored him with rich gifts and appointed him a paymaster who would supply funds in abundance and on a regular basis, as Conon might need them. His financial needs were met in large part by the confiscated estates of Tissaphernes. He also gave him authority to take as his associate for the war any Persian he might choose. And so Conon selected the satrap Pharnabazus, and then returned to Cyprus to arrange everything to suit his purpose. But when they arrived, they found a mutiny among the ranks. The lack of pay had made some of the crews fractious. However, Conon quickly restored order and continued preparing his men for the looming confrontation. Meanwhile, the Spartan campaigns in Asia Minor, although conducted officially to liberate the Asiatic Greeks from Persia, were viewed with increasing concern by the major cities in Greece. The Athenians had already shown in the 5th century BC that an empire based upon the Aegean and Asia Minor had the potential to bring the whole of Greece under its control. They feared that, if the Spartans were to add the same empire to their dominant position in the Peloponnese, and to their military influence in central and northern Greece, it would be only a matter of time before they would be crushed. Thebes, Corinth, and Argos would be encircled by land and by sea, and the Athenian supply of grain from the Black Sea would be cut off by the Spartan occupation of the Hellespont. However, the current strength of Sparta by land and by sea, the lack of finances to wage a long war, and the hostility between the Thebans and the Athenians discouraged cooperation in the first few years of the 390s BC. It was only when the threat from Agesilaus' expedition to Asia Minor became too powerful to ignore, and these factors, which had limited the ability of Sparta's enemies to hit back, were resolved, that a new quadruple alliance came together to stop Spartan expansionism. The Korinthian War, from 395 to 387 BC, is so called because the bulk of the fighting on land, after the first 2 years, was centered around the city of Corinth, where the anti-Spartan Quadruple Alliance maintained a council to oversee its efforts. But it was a war that engaged all of the major cities of Greece. The cause of that war was, in its most fundamental sense, Sparta's tyrannical behavior towards the other Greek cities, which produced a variety of reactions. First, there were the grievances that lingered from the end of the Peloponnesian War, when Spartan allies like Corinth and Thebes had been very dissatisfied with the way that the booty had been shared after the defeat of the Athenians. And those two cities were aggrieved also because the Spartans ignored their wishes as to what should have happened to Athens, since they wanted the city razed to the ground. Also, in all contacts with non-Spartans in this period, the Spartans seemed very arrogant and hard to get along with, and they certainly inspired considerable unhappiness and discontent. On top of these irritations, memories of Lysander's blatant imperialism, his likely future intentions, and his influence with Agesilaus spread great alarm among the other city-states, especially after Agesilaus made known his intention to sacrifice at Aulis, like a latter-day Agamemnon, before leading the Greeks against the Persians in Asia Minor. More evidence of Sparta's growing imperial ambitions beyond the Greek mainland is shown by their dispatch of ships to help Dionysius, the tyrant of Syracuse and Sicily, against the Carthaginians. More on that in a future episode. And so, Spartan expansion in Greece, Asia Minor, Sicily, and even Egypt, as Pharaoh Nefertitis sent equipment and grain to help the Spartans in their war against Persia, provided a greater incentive for Sparta's enemies to go to war. However, the four main discontented states, Thebes, Corinth, Argos, and Athens, were not strong enough individually to take on the Spartans, nor did they have enough money for that purpose. So the critical element necessary to create a coalition that could undertake a war against Sparta was made by the Persians. Xenophon states that the agent here was Tithrastus, but it seems unlikely for chronological reasons. So it's likely that it was Pharnabazus. In any case, the Persian satraps fully believed that Agesilaus could not be trusted and that he intended not to ever leave Asia, but rather to conquer the Persian Empire. And so, since the satraps in Asia Minor wanted to be rid of the Spartan threat, and almost certainly as a result of the revolt of Rhodes, Pharnabazus dispatched an agent, Timocritus of Rhodes, to Greece in 395 BC with 50 talents of silver. His instructions were to supply money to the leaders of Thebes, Corinth, Argos, and Athens so that they would stir up war sentiments for the Spartans, and thus force the recall of Agesilaus and his army from Asia Minor. The bribe's efficacy is debatable, though. According to Xenophon, they worked like a charm, but according to the Oxyrhynchus historian, they were wasted, since the politicians who received them hated the Spartans anyways, and were already fomenting war. In either case, Timocritus' success in this mission was the basis for Plutarch stating that 30,000 Persian archers had driven Agesilaus out of Asia, referring to the archer that was stamped on the Persian gold coins. But we will get to his recall shortly. For now, since Sparta's aggressive and unilateral actions had angered them, several important politicians in Thebes, Corinth, and Argos all were receptive to Persian support. At Athens, Xenophon names Epicrates, who was among those who fought on the side of Thrasybulus against the 30 tyrants, and Cephalus. It's not certain, but perhaps he was the same Cephalus who was a wealthy medic and arms manufacturer and the father of the orator Lysias and philosopher Polemarchus, whose house in the Piraeus is the opening scene of Plato's Republic, Although the Athenian leaders who were approached likely gave their tacit support, they did not accept the money, at least not according to Xenophon, nor did they agree to outwardly stir up anti-Spartan sentiments. However, as we mentioned last episode, there definitely was a clandestine policy taking place that promoted the toppling of Spartan power. They just had to walk a tightrope for the time being, as they did not want to annoy the Spartans for very good reasons. The Athenians currently had no navy, walls, or money, so to buck the Spartans would be an act almost of suicide, because all the Spartans needed to do was to march into Attica, and they would be slaughtered with no defenses or resources to mount one. Still, this was not the cause of the Corinthian War, as Xenophon believed. But the offer of further financial assistance from Persia was certainly another factor in persuading these three states, Thebes, Corinth, and Argos, to adopt an active policy towards containing Sparta. For one, the sum was hardly much, but the price tag is actually less important than the knowledge that they had both the might and the encouragement of the Persians behind them. And so, the previous policies of these states and the paucity of Timocrates' money showed that most of their citizens were eagerly inclined against Sparta. It's also not stated whether Timocrates told the leaders of Conan's fleet, but it's highly likely that he did, especially in the wake of Conan flipping Timocrates' own city of Rhodes the previous winter, an event which we discussed last episode. In any case, the bribed leaders in their own cities began to slander the Spartans, and when they had brought their individual cities to an anti-Spartan fervor, they then allied themselves with one another. Although the three had joined in a common cause, they had yet to establish any formal organization to shape their policy and marshal their resources. And so, their deliberations at the outset were informal. How they laid plans remains unknown, but we do know that it was Thebes who lit the spark. Rather than undertake offensive operations immediately, the Thebans chose to precipitate a war indirectly and show the Spartans how grave a strategic blunder they had made by launching an attack in Asia Minor before securing their military hegemony in Greece. When war did break out in 395 BC, it was not directly with the Spartans, but between the Phocians and Locrians in central Greece. The leading men in Thebes knew that the Spartans would not break their treaties unless someone found a means to begin the war. So, they took advantage of some long-time land dispute between these two peoples. The land in question laid between the Locrian city of Opus and the Phocian cities of Hierapolis and Abai, some 17 kilometers or 10 miles between them. It rose gradually between the slopes of the ridges to a rolling valley with Mount Parnassus clearly visible in the background. The route lacked any noticeable natural obstacles and any significant geographical features that could serve as a boundary. Essentially, a traveler did not know that he had walked from Locris to Phocis until he reached the sanctuary of Artemis and Apollo at Callipodion. Both peoples normally grazed their sheep or cattle there, and because the boundary was unrecognizable, one side or the other would often seize the livestock of the other if it considered them to be guilty of trespass. The people involved usually resolved their differences by arbitration, but in 395 BC, the Thebans persuaded the Locrians to implement a new plan that would levy a tax on the Phocians for crossing the border, with the promise of Theban military support to enforce it, if necessary. The Locrians agreed because the promise of Theban military support would free them from constant arbitration. The Thebans knew that the Phocians would respond by invading Locris, and this is exactly what happened. So when the Phocians invaded Locris and raided Locrian territory, the Thebans assisted the Locrians by jointly invading Phocis and ravaging their land in retaliation. As they had hoped, the Phocians appealed to Sparta for help. The Spartans, motivated by their longtime unhappiness with Thebes' lack of cooperation and disdain for Spartan policies, agreed to assist Phocas against Locris, knowing that Thebes was allied to Locris and that this would be a pretext for war, and one in their minds that was justified. They did not realize, though, that they had just fallen into Thebes' trap. So the ephors mobilized the army and devised an ambitious and somewhat complicated strategy for their attack on Boeotia. Pausanias was to command the expedition, and while he gathered the Spartiates and the rest of the Peloponnesian allied troops, Lysander was sent to Phocas with instructions to gather more forces from the Phocians themselves and other allies from northwest Greece. Both armies would then meet at Haliartus, which was a Boeotian city on the southern side of Lake Copus that sat on the main road to Thebes in western Boeotia. They believed that its capture would deprive the Thebans of half of their Boeotian support. And so, Lysander did as he was instructed. At the same time, Pausanias arrived in Tegea and sent out the Xenagoi, who were the Spartan officers responsible for gathering the allied troops in the Perioikid communities. Diodorus reports that they gathered 6,000 this time. When it became clear to the Thebans that the Spartans meant to launch a major campaign, they sent envoys to the Athenians to request their aid and to seek a formal alliance, not just a gentleman's agreement. The Theban envoys reminded the Athenians of the role that Thebes had played in liberating Athens by giving a home to Thrasybulus and his exiled Athenians before they were able to defeat the 30 tyrants and drive them out. Furthermore, they argued that the Athenians now had a chance to escape from their bondage to the Spartans and to reestablish themselves as an autonomous polis, along with all the others who wanted to take away power from the Spartans, which they were abusing so terribly. And so they requested a formal defensive alliance whereby an attack on either party would evoke armed help from the other. Thrasybulus, to no surprise, strongly favored this proposal. If you remember from episode 108, in the revived democracy following the 30 tyrants, Thrasybulus became a major political leader, but was soon superseded by Archinus, because he seems to have advocated for more radically democratic policies than the people were willing to accept at the time. Although he was initially cautious about offending Sparta when Persian support became available, he seems to have later pivoted to advocating for aggressive action. And at about this time, he also seems to have regained his preeminence in Athenian politics. Remarkably, Xenophon reports that the Athenian assembly voted unanimously in favor of helping the Thebans. The pro-war sentiment must have been so strong at that moment that once it was evident that there was a large majority in favor of the motion, nobody wanted to be seen as being against it, and thus being a coward. And so, everybody voted for war. Their main motivation was their fear of and need to prevent Spartan expansionism into central Greece. A Spartan victory at Thebes would have left Athens open to an attack on multiple fronts. The city stood in even greater peril because the Piraeus still lacked walls. The Thebans at least offered them the opportunity, risky though it was, to decide whether to bid for their previous prominence or to remain subservient to Sparta. In short, having made their inclinations clear to all, the Athenians needed the Thebans as much as they needed them. The Athenians likely were further encouraged by the continuing successes of Conon that year, and began to revive their ambitions of gaining their naval empire. There will be more on that shortly. In any case, following their alliance with Thebes, the Athenians sent ambassadors of their own to create similar alliances with Corinth and Argos. The result was that Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and Argos formed a grand coalition, one which historians call the Quadruple Alliance. As we mentioned, the initial Spartan strategy in this war was to invade Boeotia from two sides, with one army led by Lysander attacking from the northwest, where they were assisting the Phocians, and another army led by Pausanias marching from the Peloponnesus and attacking from the south. First, Lysander traveled to Phocis, probably by way of the Achaean port of Chiera and Heraclea Trachenia, a Spartan colony. From there, he rallied the Oetians, the Heracleots, the Malians, and the Aenianians, who were all inhabitants of the Sperocus River Valley, to the west of Thermopylae. He then led his assembled forces southward through Phocis into Boeotia. When Lysander arrived at the Boeotian city of Orchomenos, it didn't take much to persuade the Orchomenians, who were never friends of the Thebans, to provide him additional forces for his army. From there, he caught the main road heading eastward to Haliartus. Along the way, he assaulted and plundered the town of Lebadea. Then, he sent a letter to Pausanias, who was now at Plataea, to link up with him at Haliartus, promising that he and his army would arrive at its city walls by daybreak. However, this letter was intercepted by enemy scouts and brought to Thebes. Therefore, that night, they sent an advanced force ahead to Haliartus, while the main army of infantry and cavalry prepared to follow shortly after that. This advanced force marched on the double, arrived just before Lysander, and entered the city to act as a garrison. The Boeotian town of Haliartus occupied a hill and was well fortified with a circuit wall. So when Lysander arrived at dawn, just as he had intended, he decided to post his army on an adjacent hill to the east and wait for Pausanias' appearance. But as the day progressed and he had not received any word back from him, Lysander began to grow impatient. So he first went up to the wall and tried to persuade the Haliartians to revolt against Thebes and to join the Spartan side. But his defection plan was refused, thanks to the newly arrived Theban garrison. So his men took up their arms and prepared to launch an attack. But since this defection plan was refused, thanks to the newly arrived Theban garrison, his men took up their arms and prepared to launch an attack. As he led them in column formation towards the city's walls, Lysander was unaware that the main Theban army was located nearby, outside the city to the south. At the same time, the Thebans inside the city drew up in battle formation, stationed themselves just behind the gates, and kept quiet for some time. When they saw Lysander with his foremost troops approaching the wall, they suddenly threw open the city's gates and fell upon them with a sortie. It is also unclear at what point Lysander and his troops finally noticed that another squadron of Thebans was approaching them in the rear. But in the ensuing battle at the wall, his force was smashed on two sides and routed. Lysander himself was killed by the initial Theban sortie, as well as his immediate companions, and when the main Theban army smashed into the Spartan left flank, their bodies were abandoned by the walls, as the rest of his army fled eastward back to their camp. The main force of Thebans pressed the fleeing Spartans for some distance before returning back, but a select group continued their pursuit into the mountains. Xenophon gives their number as 200, while Plutarch says it was 300. These overzealous Thebans had been accused of being pro-Spartan, and in their eagerness to clear themselves of this charge in the eyes of their fellow citizens, they exposed themselves needlessly in their endeavor. Whatever the case, the uneven nature of the terrain and its narrow path slowed their pursuit, which allowed Lysander's hoplites to counterattack by doing an about-face and pelting them with javelins and stones. The Thebans thus were driven back with substantial losses, including all 200 or 300 of this eager group. This reversal caused the Thebans to return to Haliartus crestfallen, as they had suffered as many losses as they had inflicted. Total casualty counts for the Spartan army are recorded between 200 and 1,000. Certainty is impossible, but the mere fact that Lysander's army had been repulsed and then caught in a disadvantageous position indicates that losses were much heavier on their side. This is supported additionally by the nocturnal retreat of the remnants of Lysander's army, which disbanded with each contingent returning to its home country. The Thebans erected a trophy before the gates of Haliartus, as they had won the first battle of the Corinthian War. It was a clear-cut Theban victory, owing partly to Theban valor and partly to Lysander's impetuousness. Ultimately, their planned double attack on Haliartus and western Boeotia had failed, since Lysander lacked patience, and because of it, he also lost his life. News of the disaster was brought to Pausanias while he was on the march from Plataea to Thespiae. So he put his army in battle formation and double time to Haliartus. At the same time, Thrasybulus arrived at Thebes, leading the Athenian reinforcements. When Pausanias finally made it to Thebes and saw the Boeotians and Athenians lined up for battle, he called a council of his regimental commanders to discuss whether to attack or to ask for a truce in order to recover their dead who lay by the walls, which included the body of Lysander. That's because if they tried to recover them first, the enemy on the walls could threaten any who approached the corpses by shooting arrows or throwing javelins, spears, and stones at them from above. So then, weighing all of these factors, including the facts that Lysander was dead, his army defeated and scattered, the Corinthians' refusal to join their expedition, the men present not being eager for battle, and the enemy's cavalry being larger than theirs, it was decided to seek a truce to retrieve their dead, even though to ask for one was to admit defeat. However, the Thebans refused to grant such a truce unless the Spartans agreed to leave their territory. Ultimately, Pausanias submitted to this. So the Spartans collected the bodies of their dead and were forced to retreat out of Boeotia. When they had reached its boundary, on the friendly soil of the Panopeans, they buried Lysander's body and erected a monument by the road leading from Delphi to Chaeronea, which Plutarch records was still standing during his time in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. When Pausanias returned home, Lysander's faction was so indignant about his death that they charged the Spartan king with having committed capital offenses, such as failing to arrive on the arranged date for a coordinated attack, refusing to fight for the bodies of the fallen, and for an earlier crime of releasing the democratic faction in Athens. While these no doubt were trumped-up charges, reading the room and recognizing that he likely would be convicted and executed, Pausanias did not even show up to his own trial, and was subsequently sentenced to death. Instead, he fled Sparta and retired to Tegea, where he would spend the rest of his days as a suppliant in the sanctuary of Athena, before dying some years later from some illness, probably in the 370s BC. According to Ephorus, presumably as an act of vengeance, while in exile, Pausanias composed a logos, or a pamphlet, on the Spartan constitution, particularly on the poor quality of Sparta's laws. Writing was a very unusual activity for a Spartan king at the time. Unfortunately, Pausanias' text is lost, and its only mention in ancient sources comes from a corrupted passage in Strabo's Geographica, written in the time of Augustus. The main point of his pamphlet, though, seems to have been a call for the abolition of the ephors and the return to the ancestral constitution of Sparta, designed by the legendary, or perhaps mythical, lawgiver Lycurgus. Modern scholars suggest that Pausanias may have argued that the Ephorit was not founded by Lycurgus, as it had previously been assumed by the Spartans, because Aristotle, in his Politics, wrote that it was created by King Theopompus in the 8th century BC. This change of thought was perhaps due to the authority of Pausanias' logos. If so, Pausanias significantly influenced the idealization of Lycurgus in Sparta, which culminated in the 3rd century BC reforms that were claimed to have been based on Lycurgus. In any case, Pausanias' son, Agesipolis, who was still a minor, succeeded him to the Agiad throne and ruled from 395 to 380 BC. He and his even younger brother, Cleombrotus, were placed under the guardianship of their nearest relative, Aristodemus. Pausanias' exile, along with the death of Lysander, removed from the scene 2 of the 3 major actors on the Spartan political scene, leaving only Agesilaus, who would go on to dictate Spartan policy for years to come. At some point later, Agesilaus supposedly found among Lysander's papers a speech justifying the overthrow of the Spartan monarchy, which we mentioned last episode. According to Plutarch and Cornelius Nepos, he was going to publish it as evidence of Lysander's treachery when the ephors stopped him, arguing that it was better to keep it quiet so as not to inspire someone else to emulate his attempt to destroy Sparta from within. Although there is argument amongst historians as to whether this was an invention to discredit Lysander after his death, the plot at least fits with what we know of his character and ambition. Back in Asia Minor, at the beginning of the fall of 395 BC, Agesilaus and his army arrived in Hellespontine Phrygia, a territory belonging to Pharnabazus. Here, he burned and plundered the countryside, taking some cities by force, while others submitted willingly. Then, Spithridates, the rich Persian nobleman who had previously turned to the Greek side due to some slight by Pharnabazus, took Agesilaus to Paphlagonia and arranged an alliance with its king, who Xenophon named Otis. He is called Cotys by Plutarch and Gaius by the Oxyrhynchus historian. While this further secured support for Agesilaus in the Hellespontine region, more importantly, Otis provided Agesilaus with 1,000 horses and 2,000 peltasts for his army. In appreciation, Agesilaus brought about a marriage between Otis and the daughter of Spithridates. A ship was immediately dispatched to retrieve the girl. Then, with winter approaching, Agesilaus had concerns about his army's provisions. So he moved his men into the very center of Hellespontine Phrygia, towards Dascalaon, the seat of Pharnabazus' royal residence. He wintered in the region around the city, where he obtained provisions for his army. Xenophon says that the land around Dascalaon was very fruitful. It had lots of large villages, flushed with all of the provisions that Agesilaus' men needed, and held perfect hunting and fishing grounds. The Greeks got into the habit of foraging, and thanks in part to the excess that was available, and in part to the lack of opposition that they had faced in doing so, they became lax and careless in their manner, and so they failed to keep up their guard. But on one winter's day, Pharnabazus surprised those who were out foraging with 2 scythed chariots and 400 cavalrymen. You might remember scythed chariots from the Battle of Cunaxa. They were fitted with blades on the axles and the undercarriage to chop up and destroy enemy formations. Well, when they spotted the approaching enemy, about 700 Greeks gathered into a tight formation as a makeshift phalanx. But with the scythed chariots bearing down on them, they scattered. In their flight, Pharnabazus' cavalrymen were able to chase them down and spear about 100 of them in the back. The rest managed to flee to Agesilaus and the bulk of the army, who fortunately were nearby. Otherwise, Greek losses could have been even worse. The Greeks quickly got their revenge, though. A few days later, Spithridates learned that Pharnabazus' camp was near a village called Kaiai, about 18 miles or 29 kilometers away, and he immediately informed one of his Spartiate officers, Euripides, of this intelligence. Taking a force of 2,000 hoplites, 2,000 peltasts, and the combined cavalry of Spithridates and the Paphlagonians, Euripides set out that night and fell upon the camp at dawn. They slew many of the Mesians, who acted as Pharnabazus' advance guard. The satrap and his men escaped, but the camp and all of its contents were captured. For some reason, though, Euripides didn't allow Spithridates and the Paphlagonians their share of the booty. Insulted, they left the Greek army that night. Xenophon says that their defection caused Agesilaus much grief. A large portion of his force had just abandoned him because of a needless show of Spartan arrogance. As an aside, it seems that when Spithridates left Agesilaus' army, he went to Sardis, which at that time was controlled by Ariaeus, while Tithrastus was visiting the Persian king's court. Spithridates may have been trying to interest Ariaeus in joining in his rebellion against the king. According to Xenophon, Spithridates put his trust in Ariaeus because he had already revolted against the king once, which could have been a reference to Ariaeus' involvement in Cyrus's rebellion against Artaxerxes, or perhaps may have suggested that Ariaeus was again in open rebellion. If it was the latter, Ariaeus likely was not the one entrusted to watch Sardis while Tithrustus was gone, but instead took it for himself. This would be the last we hear of both Ariaeus and Mithridates, though, as they ominously disappear from the sources. In any case, Xenophon records how a little bit later, during the winter of 395-394 BC, a guest friend of both Agesilaus and Pharnabazus, a man named Apollophanes of Cyzicus, arranged a meeting between the two commanders. Pledges of truce were given, and they both arrived at an agreed-upon place. At the meeting, after the appropriate formalities and salutations, Pharnabazus spoke first, recalling his good service to the Spartans in their war with Athens, and asking how it is just that they repay him now by destroying and plundering his property. Agesilaus disregarded this, and instead tried to persuade Pharnabazus to rebel against Artaxerxes and to ally with the Spartans. Pharnabazus replied that he would remain loyal to the king, so long as he was not subjected to another commander. Despite this rejection, Agesilaus then vowed to leave Phrygia and not to disturb his property again. They exchanged gifts and pledged to be guest friends. Agesilaus then departed from Pharnabazus' territory and camped his army to the south on the plain of Thebe. As winter was now coming to a close, Agesilaus prepared to march inland towards the Persian heartland until an unexpected messenger arrived from Sparta. In response to their difficulties in Greece, because of which they feared that their enemies had become too powerful and that Sparta was now in danger, the Spartans were forced to recall Agesilaus and his army from Asia Minor. Plutarch says that, in his estimation, Agesilaus never performed a more noble or greater deed than in returning home to save his country, nor was there a fairer example of righteous obedience to authority. Despite the hyperbole, and Agesilaus being understandably disappointed, the summons likely was a blessing in disguise. Although he and others thought that he could conquer Asia, he had neither the strategic ability nor the necessary supplies to get past Sardis, let alone Susa or Persepolis. So after receiving his new orders, Agesilaus called his Asiatic Greek allies together and promised that in return for their help in Greece, he would return to Asia and resurrect his grand campaign to liberate them. They all voted to help him, and he set about maintaining and even strengthening the army that Sparta had amassed over its 3-year campaign in the region. A major stumbling block, though, was that no matter what their commanders had agreed to, the Asiatic Greek soldiers themselves were not enthralled by the idea of going abroad and leaving their homes behind for a war that did not protect their families in Asia Minor. Agesilaus anticipated this apathy, and instead of trying to convince them with clever speeches, he offered prizes to the cities that could provide the best army, the mercenary commander that could send the best force of hoplites, archers, and peltasts, and the cavalry commander who could furnish his force with the best horses and riders. The prizes range from the best hoplite equipment made by master craftsmen to the very best in cavalry arms, gold crowns, and so forth. He was smart enough, though, not to give out the prizes until the army had crossed well into Europe and the men were fully committed to the expedition. The incentive was strong enough that Agesilaus was able to recruit enough soldiers that he could leave behind a large enough force to maintain a suitable defense of the area. Therefore, leaving behind Euxinus as Harmost and a garrison of 4,000 men to protect the Greek cities, Agesilaus marched his army to and across the Hellespont. Despite his earlier promises, though, no Spartan army would ever return to Asia again. And despite the fact that they still had 4,000 troops in Asia Minor, the Spartans' war to liberate the Greeks had come to an end. The Greeks in Asia remained as securely under Persian control as the day when Thibron first set foot there. Although the Spartan invasion of Persia amounted to nothing, an unwavering memory of it remained in Greece. Agesilaus departed still undefeated in the field, and had actually beaten the Persians in a modest battle. He had played 2 satraps for fools, and the only way the Persians could think to get rid of him was to bribe Sparta's opponents in Greece. Agesilaus appeared to have shown that the Persian Empire was weak and ripe for the taking by someone with the proper resources. But I am getting way ahead of myself. Returning to Greece, that winter of 395-394 BC, on the heels of their victory at Haliartus, the Allies set up a Synhedrion, or Common Council, in Corinth. It's not stated how many representatives were sent, but each of the 4 allies enjoyed an equal vote in the council's decisions. Joint military planning included discussions of and agreement on strategy and tactics. All that the members could do in such situations was to resolve differences through discussion and negotiation. The Allies lacked any institutional instrument for resolving disputes and enforcing their will. However, despite their occasional differences and institutional imperfections, the Allies successfully maintained a working alliance. Once they formed plans and worked out their common arrangements for the war that winter, they then dispatched ambassadors to various Greek cities, looking for them to join their cause as well. Their recent victory at Haliartus, though a minor one, demonstrated that they could win in the field, as well as their cohesion and ability to work together harmoniously and successfully. Seeing this, many allies of the Spartans, who were only allied to them out of necessity, were willing to withdraw from them, including all of Euboea, the Leucadians, the Acarnanians, and the Ambraciots in west-central Greece along the Ionian Sea, and the Halkidians of Thrace and other towns in the northern Aegean. This all suggests that there was quite a lot of anti-Spartan sentiment in the Greek world at this time, which very often happens when any state seems to be too strong, too powerful, and too much of a threat to what everybody else wants. The Allied ambassadors also attempted to persuade the inhabitants of the Peloponnese to revolt against the Spartans, but no one listened to them since Sparta, lying as it does along its southeastern side, was a kind of citadel and fortress of the entire Peloponnese. In any case, the position of these lesser, non-Big Four allies in the council is unclear. They all surely must have had a voice, because as we will see, they will supply troops to the fight. Even if they played only a minor role in affairs, nothing more than accepting or rejecting the decisions of the leading powers, their very presence proves at least some formal connection with the Big Four. Furthermore, either they concluded formal treaties with one, more, or all of these major powers, or they just followed the policy of a state with which they were already allied. For example, the Locrians were traditional friends of the Thebans and had concluded a separate alliance with Athens, but they are not known to have made formal ties with Argos and Corinth. To complicate matters, Thebes and Athens had concluded a separate alliance binding only the two. The treaty lacked a clause requiring them to have the same friends and enemies as the other, which in this particular instance formally excluded the Argives and Corinthians. Indeed, the former sometimes acted against the two others. From the evidence stems the conclusion that actual relations among the allies, both major and minor, were more fluid and individual than purely legal. Nothing indicates that the Allies envisioned a coherent, tightly structured organization of adherents with a formal membership ratified by all, and an established set of rules, rights, and obligations. This alliance, then, did not constitute a formal political organization, complete with a recognized permanent leader, treasury, taxes, and protocol. It was rather an aggregate of agreements that constituted a tidy, close-knit general alliance suitable for the purpose of fighting Sparta, but nothing resembling a league. Despite the uncertainties, some definite things can be said of the alliance's actual functioning. Their finances were simple, as each ally paid for its own forces, and their primary aim, as already stated, was to defeat Sparta, and so the existence of the body was limited to that goal. No one entertained the idea of creating a permanent political organization for any future purpose. At the outset of the war, the Allies had openly appealed to all Greek states to join them, and some did, but there was never a strong or obvious urge towards pan-Hellenism. The various states simply chose their sides, either to settle old scores or to win new advantages. The Thebans and the Athenians were themselves formidable enough to confound Spartan ambitions, but the addition of the Argives and the Corinthians formed a much more daunting challenge. So long as these four could maintain their political cohesion and protect their lands from being plundered, they were economically strong enough to maintain their armies as easily as the Spartans could. Furthermore, their superiority in numbers meant that they could absorb combat losses more readily than the Spartans. Their situation was further enhanced by the fact that Sparta was fighting a war in two theaters, and that the Quadruple Alliance had Persian backing. Content to take the Persian king's money to instigate war against their local enemy, they cared little for the situation in the east. No one but the Athenians, who did so for their own purposes, more on that shortly, showed any interest in forging stronger ties with the Persian king. The others were decidedly suspicious of him, but as a group, the allies seemed to have formulated no official policy regarding him, and for the moment apparently gave him little thought. Bent solely on the defeat of Sparta, they paid little attention to the future. That could wait until after the Spartan hegemony was toppled. According to Diodorus, later that winter, the allies also took the offensive in northern Greece, where they were conveniently invited to intervene in Thessalian affairs. Thessaly had a long history of internal strife due to the ambition of the dynasts of the major cities, wishing to seize supreme power over the others. At that time, Medius, the ruler of Larissa, was at war with Lycophron, the tyrant of Pherae. So when Medius asked the allied council to send him aid, they jumped at the opportunity. The Spartans were allied with Lycophron, still maintained a garrison in Pharsalus, and had friendly relations with their colony, Heraclea and Trachis, giving them at least a tenuous hold on the area. Now, with Lysander dead and Pausanias exiled, Medius' request gave the allies an opportunity to crush the isolated Spartans there. And so, the council voted to send 2,000 Theban and Argive troops under the command of a Theban named Hysmenius. His mission was to give aid to Medius, to eliminate Spartan power in the north, and to punish the Phocians and their neighbors who had provided aid to the Spartans at Haliartus. Upon their arrival, Medius and Hysmenius marched on and seized Pharsalus, expelling the Spartan garrison and selling their inhabitants into slavery, with the Spartans probably along with them. Hysmenius then parted company with Medius and marched on and seized Heraclea and Trachis. They killed all of the Spartans whom they caught, but allowed the other Peloponnesians to leave unharmed with their possessions. Here is the first sign that Hysmenius wished to divide the Peloponnesians from the Spartans, an objective that future Theban politicians would pursue throughout the rest of the 4th century BC. He next invited the Trachinian exiles, whom the Spartans had banished, to return to their homes and to govern their city, no doubt in a manner friendly to the alliance. With these two actions, Hysmenius had eliminated Spartan power in the north, while simultaneously gaining control of Thermopylae, the very important bottleneck between central and northern Greece. Afterwards, he left behind the Argives to garrison Heraclea and Trachis, while he led his Thebans to the Aenianians and the Athymanians and persuaded them to revolt against the Spartans. Here, he managed to marshal 4,000 troops from them and their allies. From Heraclea and Trachis, he moved along the coast to Thermopylae, before turning southward to Neryx and Locris, whose possession gave the Thebans and their allies, the Locrians, control of communications between Phocis and those near the Aegean. Hysmenius' position was now too menacing for the Phocians to ignore, and in response, a Laconian named Lachisthenes led a Phocian army to dislodge them. The two forces fought a hard and long battle, in which the Thebans were the ultimate victors. Hysmenius' men pursued the fleeing Phocians until nightfall, inflicting heavy casualties along the way. The final casualty count was 1,000 Phocians and 500 for Hysmenius' men. Afterwards, Hysmenius dismissed his army to return to their homes. He had achieved all of the campaign's objectives, and the Allied Council was beaming with such confidence that they were now willing to take the war to Sparta. So they began to gather at Corinth soldiers from all the cities, more than 15,000 infantrymen, and about 500 cavalrymen in total. The Quadruple Alliance's aim was to gain control of the isthmus in order to keep the Spartans blocked in the Peloponnesus so that they could not get into central Greece and defeat their opponents individually in Boeotia and Attica. The defeat at Haliartus and Hysmenius' successful campaign in the north prompted the Spartan government to take the allied threat very seriously. So pivoting to their new strategy, they decided to strike the allies at their seat in Corinth, itself a formidable challenge, and so they began to make considerable preparations. But by the early spring of 394 BC, Agesilaus still hadn't arrived back from Asia Minor. In fact, he was still a ways off, somewhere along the Thracian coast of the northern Aegean. Therefore, they had to make a move without him. According to Diodorus, the ephors mobilized the full might of the Peloponnesian League, gathering together 23,000 infantrymen and 500 cavalrymen. Since Agesilaus was still a boy, his guardian Aristodemus took command and marched the army towards the isthmus. Meanwhile, their opponents had already mustered their forces at Corinth and came together to deliberate on strategy, how deep the phalanx should be, and who should command it. As a rule of thumb, the commander of an allied army was generally someone in whose territory the battle would be fought. So it was most probably a Corinthian here, perhaps Timoleus, the leading politician at Corinth who suggested the bold stroke of invading Spartan territory itself, a fertile and mountain-ringed part of Greece that hadn't seen an invading enemy army in centuries. Timoleus said that the Spartans, like rivers, were likely to be weakest at their source. Likewise, he argued that wasps are most easily killed by setting their nests on fire, rather than waiting for them to swarm out to defend themselves. Ultimately, on the advice of Timoleus, the allies decided to take the fight as near to Sparta as possible, in order to prevent them from accumulating even more troops as they marched through the Peloponnesus, which they would in the form of the Tegeans and the Mantineans. This would have been a daring, but wise strategy, and some scholars question whether it would have really been proposed at the time. Either way, though, the allies took too long to agree on it, and so the Spartan preparations were too far advanced for it to succeed. Before the allies even could mobilize, they received news that the Spartan army had entered western Corinthia, burning and plundering along the way. And so, the allies quickly deployed the army to march out to meet them. As they arrived at the dry bed of the Nemea River, to the west of Corinth, they learned that the Spartan army had already arrived at Sicyon, which was about 10 miles or 16 kilometers to the northwest. Sicyon would serve as the Spartan base of operations. From there, the Spartans moved east into the flat coastal plain along the Gulf of Corinth. At the same time, the Allies made good use of their light troops by occupying the high ground of the slope, which skirts the entire southern limit of the plain. From there, the Allied light-armed troops hurled their javelins and arrows, doing much damage to the marching Spartan army from above. But once they had marched past their position, and out of range of their missiles, the Spartans were able to enter the plain unopposed, and destroyed the land with fire, before setting up camp on the Nemea River's eastern bank. Although it had long since been dried out, the Nemea River once rose in the vicinity of Nemea and flowed north, emptying into the Gulf of Corinth. In any case, not wanting to engage the Spartans quite yet, the Allies withdrew a mile further to the east, and closer to Corinth, on the far bank of the river now called the Rachiani, to set up their own camp. The following day, a standard hoplite battle took place on the open ground in the Nemea River Valley. Assessing total fighting forces for both sides is almost impossible, though. Xenophon records that on the Spartan side were 6,000 Spartiate hoplites, led by Aristodemus, along with 7,500 from assorted Peloponnesian allies, including 3,000 from Elis and its neighbors, 1,500 from Sicyon, and 3,000 combined from the cities of Epidaurus, Troezen, Hermione, and Halias in the Argolid. Xenophon, though, forgets to mention how many Tegeans and Mantineans there were, which we know fought in the battle, and which throws off the total numbers. A conservative estimate of an additional 5,000 or 2,500 each seems sensible, bringing the total hoplite force to about 18,500. In addition, there were about 600 Spartan cavalrymen, 300 Cretan archers, and 400 Elean slingers. But these forces were not mentioned during the course of the battle itself. Some scholars suspect that there must also have been non-Spartan perioikoi and other residents of Laconia, though this is by no means certain. Diodorus later records that there were about 23,000 infantrymen for the Spartans and 15,000 for the Quadruple Alliance. For the Spartan figure to be anywhere near reconcilable with Xenophon, an additional 9,500 hoplites need to be found, which as we have seen is unlikely, because that would mean that the cities of Tegea, Mantinea, and Pellene could accumulate a force larger than all of Euboea and Boeotia combined, or alternatively, more than Athens and Corinth. There is the possibility, though, that Diodorus got the figures the wrong way around, as his numbers do pretty much conform to Xenophon's assessment when they are reversed. In fact, according to Xenophon, the Allies had 24,000 total hoplites. 6,000 Athenians, likely led by Thrasybulus, 7,000 Argives, 5,000 Boeotians, 3,000 Corinthians, and 3,000 Euboeans, though he himself is quite skeptical of the figure for the Argives as well. Their cavalry had about 1,550, the bulk of which came from Thebes and Athens, and an even larger, though undisclosed, number of light armed troops from Corinth, Locris, Malis, and Acarnania. In any case, at the Nemea River, somewhere in the neighborhood of 37,500 to 42,500 Greek hoplites likely clashed against one another. It would be the largest land battle yet fought between Greek polis. At dawn, the Quadruple Alliance's army arranged in battle formation, crossed the Rakiani River, and marched west towards the Spartan camp near the Nemea River. Due to the conglomerate nature of the Allied army, the prestigious role of commanding the right wing was likely rotated each day, and fighting wouldn't occur until this second day. This is not mentioned by Xenophon, but is an assertion by some scholars who do not see the preceding tactics as spur-of-the-moment accidents, but as planned strategies. In any case, the Boeotians were said to have been against action while they held the left wing, knowing that they would have to face the Spartiates on their right flank. But once they were moved to the right wing, opposite the Sicyonians, they were eager to engage, while the Athenians on the left faced the Spartans. Again, this seems to be another example of Xenophon's constant denigration of the Thebans, as he implies that they were scared to fight the Spartans. In any case, the Argives stood beside the Athenians in the center left. Presumably, the Corinthians took station in the center right, between them and the Thebans. The Athenian and Theban cavalry probably were placed in their usual position on the flanks, but their part in the battle seems to have been minor. The Battle of the Nemea River, as it is called, would prove to be, above all, a contest of hoplites. Xenophon says that, instead of the usual 8, the Allies here adopted a 16-deep formation. The Thebans, though, thinking of their success at Delion 3 decades earlier, arranged their own lines on the right wing to a considerably greater depth of 25 ranks deep. The battle itself is a showpiece for Spartan discipline and skill, as well as a lack of coordination and cooperation among the allies. As the Thebans, with their extraordinarily deep ranks, began their forward march, they steadily veered right, which was a universal tendency of hoplite armies, since the men naturally moved to the right to protect their unprotected right sides and to outflank the enemy's left. Again, as was typically the case, the other contingents were then forced to follow ever so right as well, so as to keep there from being gaps in the line. Since their depth was much deeper than usual, their line's width was thinner, so they were doubly aware of the danger of their own encirclement. The ground between the two armies was wooded and covered with various obstacles, so the Spartans at first did not even know that the enemy was bearing down on them. But once the Spartans heard the enemy paeon, the battle song ritually sung by Greek armies marching into battle, they immediately readied themselves for combat. The Spartans took their position on the right alongside the Tegeans in the center right, and they orchestrated an identical right-leaning move to the Thebans. Although we are not told how deep the Spartans stacked their line, it's likely that they didn't deepen their lines, as had the allies, and instead had the traditional 8. As a result, they stretched their right wing past the enemy's left to such an extent that there were only 6 of the 10 Athenian tribes lined up against them, while the other 4 found themselves opposite the Tegeans. If true, this would mean that the Spartans had over half of their men facing no opposition at all. And what is even more interesting is that this would have been the far right of their line, which is usually the most elite of the Spartan fighting force. Modern estimates have the front of the Spartan army stretching for approximately 1 mile, or 1,500 meters. The disposition of the rest of the Spartan line is largely unknown, except that the Tegeans were in the center right, next to the Spartans, and that the Sicyonians anchored the left. The rest of their Peloponnesian allies were scattered in some unknown arrangement in the center and center left. When the two armies were about 500 feet apart, the Spartans halted and sacrificed a goat to Artemis Agroterra, or Artemis the Huntress, as they supposedly did before any engagement. This was not necessarily a tactical decision, but it did have the effect of allowing the lines to become reordered before the final charge. With the customary sacrifice complete, the Spartans then charged. As they ran, their right curved their line around the Athenian wing so as to outflank it. This created a battle line in the form of an L shape. Quite simply, the Spartan right had overlapped the Athenians on the allied left, and so they probably knew that they were doomed before the first spear met an enemy shield. When the armies came to grips, the Thebans crushed the Sicyonians, and the Corinthians and Argives pushed back their opponents, leaving the entire left and center of the Spartan line broken and in flight. Xenophon says laconically that all of Sparta's allies were bested by their coalition foes opposite of them. Only the soldiers of Spartan allied Pellene, facing off against the Boeotian Thespians, stood their ground. The soldiers of Pellene and Thespia died to a man, standing their ground against one another, the ultimate example of hoplite valor. The Spartans themselves, though, were victorious over the 6 tribes of the Athenians that they had overlapped, killing many in the process. Those on the Spartan wing who had turned inwards could now roll up the enemy line towards the center. The Spartans then marched behind the enemy line in a direction perpendicular to the battlefront, past the other 4 Athenian tribes who were victorious against the Tegeans, and so had pushed the line forward and were not in the Spartans' line of sight. However, as the other victorious contingents of the allied army began making their way back across the field after driving off Sparta's allies, the Spartans in turn attacked the unprotected right sides of the Argives, Corinthians, and finally the Thebans, killing a great many and causing the rest to flee for the security of Corinth. And so, the Spartan contingent alone had routed the entire allied army. The distance from the battlefield to Corinth was about 3 miles, or 5 kilometers. After the first wave of fleeing allied survivors were admitted behind Corinth's walls, the remainder were callously shut out for some unknown reason, so they had to return to their camp by the Rachiani River. Demosthenes, though, suggests the opposite, that the walls were at first closed against them, but that the anti-Spartan faction in the city then opened them. With the battle over and night beginning to fall, the Spartans did not pursue after them. Regardless, it is unknown whether a group within the city was opposed to the venture, or whether the Corinthians simply panicked at the magnitude of the defeat. If it was the former, they were still in the minority, though as we will see, it is a sign of serious problems to come for Corinth. In any case, the Spartans had won an awesome victory, and so they put up their victory trophy and collected their dead, as did the losers under a truce the following day. Xenophon does not give us numbers of casualties, except that only 8 Spartiates died, though Diodorus claims that the Spartan side lost 1,100, almost all of which were their allies, while the Quadruple Alliance lost 2,800. Despite the fact that the cavalry was not mentioned in the battle's narrative, we do know that it was involved because one of those who we know to have died in this battle was an Athenian cavalryman named Dexilaus, whose famous grave stela has been found at the Kerameikos, as we described in episode 79. Although the Spartans had won a resounding tactical victory at Nemea, it had little strategic effect, with the big four still maintaining control of Corinth, and thus preventing the Spartans from entering central Greece through the isthmus. In purely military terms, the Spartans had mauled, but not destroyed the allied army. Though very badly shaken, the alliance remained intact, and not one of the allies capitulated after the battle. At the same time, the Spartans' own allies had suffered severely. A visible sign that the war was about to descend into stalemate came from the Allied decision to make Corinth their base. The Spartans responded by making Sicyon their home, an admission that they could not win the war even by one such grand victory. Furthermore, instead of immediately capitalizing on their victory, they chose to await the arrival of Agesilaus. Returning to the waters of the Eastern Aegean, for the past 2 years, the Persians held a definitive defensive line from Konos to Larima to Rhodes. This line gave them the security of knowing that a Spartan-led fleet could not transit through the southeast corner of the Aegean without a major battle taking place. However, Conon had been relatively inactive during that time, which led the Spartans to become somewhat complacent. Since they lost control of Rhodes, the peninsula of Knidos had become the primary staging area for the Spartan fleet of 85 ships under Pysandros. When Conon received his reinforcements, bringing his fleet up to 170 ships, it seemed probable to the Spartans that he was planning some major expedition. For a fleet of this size, there were two logical targets. Either Conon was going to exploit the reduced Spartan presence in Asia Minor by raiding the coasts and retaking the Greek cities, or he was aiming to cross the Aegean and to support the anti-Spartan coalition by supplying them with such a formidable naval contingent. At that point, in August of 394 BC, Conon commanded 90 ships initially stationed near Larima on the tip of the Cnidian Chersonese, which jutted out on the Carian coastline. It sat in a strategic position to the northwest of Rhodes. These 90 ships are sometimes known as the Greek vanguard, as they were the best of the 170 ships in the entire Persian fleet, and would have been manned by Conon's most experienced Greek crewmen. Conon was a seasoned naval commander, who was not as much a Greek commander leading a foreign fleet, as he was a Greek commander leading a Greek fleet given to him by a foreign backer. This meant that the language on the ships was Greek, that the tactics he used were Greek, and that the way he dealt with his men was Greek, all of which meant that everyone under his direct command knew what was expected of them at all times. Most of the non-Greek forces, usually Phoenicians, were under Pharnabazus and the other 80 ships. These were stationed separately from Conon's Greek vanguard, further east on the Rhodian Chersonese. On the other hand, the Spartan fleet was led by the inexperienced Pysandros. Although his crews were experienced men, drawn from all over the Greek world, they weren't necessarily the best. Not only could Conon attract Athenian sailors, who were often considered the very best, but he also had access to Persian funds, enabling him to pay his men a slightly higher rate than the Spartans could afford, which would have allowed Conon to recruit the best non-Athenian sailors also. According to Isocrates, King Evagrius of Cyprus contributed the greatest part of the non-Athenian Greek forces under Conon. The sources, Xenophon and Diodorus, are relatively vague on the details of the ensuing naval battle, but it seems that Pysandros wanted to engage and defeat Conon's Greek vanguard while they were still separated from Pharnabazus and the Phoenicians. If he was successful here, then he could engage the rest of the Persian fleet at another time down the road. This was his only option, because there was no way that he could defeat the enemy, who maintained a 2-to-1 numerical advantage, when they were all together. It's also possible that Conon wanted to lure Pysandridas into a trap by moving his Greek vanguard closer and hoping to elicit a response from him. In any case, on one particular day, Pysandros manned all of his ships and put them out to sea, moving east from Cnidus to a bay closer to Laurima. Its exact location is not certain, but it must have been well concealed, as neither fleet had any real understanding of what the other was doing. A bit later, after giving his final orders, Pysandros commanded his fleet to take to the sea once again and to sail around the remaining promontories in order to descend on the unwitting ships of Conon. The timing of this attack, the aggression of his offensive, and his understanding of the coastal geography enabled Pysandros to catch Conon completely off guard. When Pysandros' fleet appeared over the horizon, Conon had not yet gotten his ships into battle formation, and Pharnabazus and the Phoenicians were even further away east, and in an even greater state of disorder. No matter the case, no doubt Conon and Pharnabazus saw the opportunity before them. If Conon could hold on until Pharnabazus and the Phoenicians arrived, the Persian fleet had a great opportunity to destroy the Spartan fleet. As the two sides engaged in the so-called Battle of Cnidus, Pysandros led in stereotypical Spartan fashion from the front. His ships quickly overwhelmed the most geographically advanced of Conon's fleet and pushed them back into the bulk of the vanguard. In stark contrast to Pysandridas' ordered lines and calm advance, Conon's fleet was in a panic, trying hard to form a combative line capable of withstanding an attack that was already picking up momentum. His fleet could do little more than resist with all of their might. The fighting took to the decks as the Greek marines on each side fought it out. Pysandridas' victory was there for the taking, if not for an unwelcome sight heading towards his left wing. Conon's men had held on just long enough to allow the arrival of Pharnabazus and the Phoenicians, and their ships were now in battle formation, bearing down on the contingent of Sparta's allies, but the mere sight of Pharnabazus' Phoenician fleet was enough for many of the allies to turn and row back to Cnidus. Even in the face of such desertion, and now being exposed to a flanking attack, Pysandros thought that it would be disgraceful and unworthy of a Spartan for him to flee as well. So he maintained his offensive by turning his attention towards Pharnabazus' oncoming ships. Plowing his trireme into the closely packed enemy ships, Pysandros fought admirably, but he was too isolated, and the loss of his allies gave Conon time to regroup and re-engage in the battle. Eventually, Pysandridas' ship was rammed hard, and the Navarch died, fighting enemy combatants on his ship, and with him went the rest of his fleet's will to fight. The battle quickly turned into a rout, and the Spartan fleet was aggressively pursued by Conon's fleet back to Cnidus, where they captured 50 of the enemy's beached triremes. As for the crews, most of them leapt overboard and swam safely to shore, though 500 men were captured. The other 35 triremes were able to make it back safely to Cnidus. For Conon, this victory was redemption for the disgrace at Aigospotamoi a decade earlier, inflicting a total victory over his hated enemy. For the Spartans, this loss essentially ended any hope of their imperial policy in the east, because since they were at war with Persia, there wasn't a financial backer present this time for them to rebuild a new fleet. Even more, Sparta never again engaged in major military efforts at sea, and so the maritime empire created by Lysander had lasted only 11 years. As a result, Conon's victory at Cnidus was an essential turning point in the war. In fact, the later Greek historian Polybius considered it to be the end of Sparta's period of power in general, though most others believe that this turning point did not take place for a few decades. Afterwards, Conon and Pharnabazus set out on a cruise through the eastern Aegean. On Conus' advice, Pharnabazus assured the Greek cities on the coast of Asia Minor that if they left the Spartan alliance and resumed paying tribute to Persia, he would respect their autonomy, meaning they could keep their traditional forms of government, and no Persian governor or military garrisons would be installed unless invited to do so. With Conon leading the charge, this prompted a wave of defections from Sparta, including Cos, Samos, and Ephesus. As a result, Spartan domination in the Aegean collapsed, and the Harmosts and garrisons in these cities were expelled, instigating pro-Athenian and pro-democracy movements. At Samos and Ephesus, their citizens erected bronze statues of Conon and his son Timotheus, honoring these saviors as if they were divine heroes. Abydos and Sestos were the only cities to refuse to expel their Spartan inhabitants, because Pharnabazus' longtime enemy, Thrasyllus, happened to be in the area at this time, and he convinced them to continue to resist the Persians. In particular, he made Abydos a haven for Spartan Harmosts who had fled or were driven from their commands. So when Pharnabazus received word of this, he announced to these two cities that unless they expelled the Spartans, he would declare war on them. When they ignored his order, he disembarked from his fleet at Ephesus and marched overland to a satrapy in order to gather his army, while Conon was ordered to sail 40 of the triremes and meet him in the Hellespont. Once there, Conon blockaded their harbors, while the Persian army laid waste to their territories. When this failed to force them to capitulate, with winter fast approaching, Pharnabazus departed back to his palace at Daskalaion for winter quarters and ordered Conon to win over the rest of the cities of the Hellespont and to muster as large a fleet as possible for the following spring. Also, in 394 BC, we start seeing the city-states of Byzantion, Cyzicus, Ephesus, Samos, Iasus, Cnidos, Rhodes, and Lampsacus minting coins on the same standard. These coins raise the historical problem of the nature of their association. Whether it was a political alliance or a commercial union remains unknown, but it seems that they formed some sort of organization whose purpose may well have aimed at protecting their local interests without alienating the Persians. At the same time, we see the Athenians taking their first steps in rebuilding their imperial power in the Aegean. Under the guidance of Thrasybulus, they began to restore their long walls, to remend their relations with Thasos, and to reopen communications with Rhodes. They also cast their diplomatic net more widely to include Dionysius of Syracuse in the west and Evagrius of Cyprus in the east. Although they did not conclude an alliance with the Syracusan tyrant, they were able to dissuade Dionysius, at least for now, from sending a fleet of triremes to the Spartans' aid. On the other hand, as he had taken in Conon, Evagrius had made no qualms about his pro-Athenian stance. So they used this opportunity to publicly thank him for past services and for future ones. By the year's end, the Athenians once again had an influence that stretched from Thasos in the Hellespont in the north, southward along the Aegean coastline, down to Rhodes in the southeast. Meanwhile, throughout 394 BC, Agesilaus was hurrying through Thrace to bring assistance to the Spartans. His main aim, apart from bringing his considerable booty safely to Sparta, was to restore the Spartans' control in the northern half of central Greece, which would be an excellent springboard for regaining their dominant position in mainland Greece. As he marched from Asia to central Greece, he sent envoys to the various peoples asking whether he should traverse their country as a friend or as a foe. For the most part, he was received as a friend. But Plutarch reports that at one point he was opposed by the Thracians, a Thracian tribe, who demanded that he pay 100 talents of silver and 100 women as the price for passage. Agesilaus answered them with scorn and chose to fight his way through their land. In a battle that we have very little information about, the Spartans were victorious and slew many Thracians. When he had reached Amphipolis in the Halkidiki, Thrasyllus met him there and reported that the Spartans had just gained a great victory, presumably referring to the one at Nemea. Agesilaus then ordered him to go to the allied cities in Asia and announce the victory too. According to Plutarch, far from being overjoyed at their victory and the loss of so few Spartan soldiers, Agesilaus lamented that so many Greeks had died needlessly in battle fighting against each other, instead of against a common enemy, as he believed that together they could have taken down the entire Persian Empire. Continuing west, Agesilaus and his men passed through Macedon without incident, despite the Macedonian king being allied with the Athenians. But when they turned south, Agesilaus would be forced to fight his way through Thessaly against those allied to the Thebans, in particular as they passed through the cities of Larissa, Cranon, Scotusa, and Pharsalus, all four of which straddled his route southward. To the first city of Larissa, hoping to secure their friendship, he sent two high-ranking Spartiates, Xenocles and Scythes, as ambassadors. But these men were arrested and kept in close custody. In retaliation, his fellow officers thought that Agesilaus should encamp about Larissa and lay siege to it, but he declared that even the capture of all of Thessaly would not compensate for the loss of either of his high-ranking officers, so he opted instead to make terms with the enemy in order to get them back. The Spartiate population, as we discussed last episode, was in decline, so the recent loss of Spartiates near Haliartus and Nemea likely factored into his decision here, as well as his need to quickly get back to southern Greece. In any case, along the way, the Thessalian cavalry was such a threat that he led his army in a hollow square, placing half of his cavalry in the front and half in the rear. When the Thessalians tried to hinder his progress by attacking those in the rear, he sent all of his horsemen in the front, except those who were his personal bodyguard, to bring aid to them, and vice versa. The Thessalians were less inclined to fight such a strong hoplite formation, while the Greeks at the same time were understandably cautious in pursuing any cavalry they chased off, so as to not lose their defensive formation and expose themselves to counterattack. The stalemate was finally broken by Agesilaus when he recombined his cavalry force and ordered 500 of them to attack the Thessalian horsemen without giving up the pursuit. The tactic worked, and the Thessalians fled in a panic, with a few killed and many more captured. In particular, the Pharsalian hipparch, a man named Polycarmus, was killed. They pursued them all the way to Mount Narthokion in Malis, before returning to the main army. Agesilaus was especially pleased with this relatively minor victory, because the Thessalians were said to have had the best cavalrymen in Greece. He then set up a victory trophy, and there was no further incident for the remainder of his journey through Thessaly. Still, the Thessalians had slowed his march, thereby buying time for the allies to the south to prepare their defense. On his march, Agesilaus followed the same route as had been traveled by Xerxes nearly a century earlier, though the Spartan king found the pass at Thermopylae undefended. Instead, at Thermopylae, he received orders from the ephors that he was to invade Boeotia immediately. Although he had intended first to return to Sparta, muster his whole army, and then invade Boeotia, he did not disobey the magistrates. So he sent for reinforcements from the Peloponnesus, with orders to cross over the Corinthian Gulf and meet him at an unspecified location on the Phocian-Boeotian border. Continuing through the pass into Phocis, which was friendly to Sparta, they reached the border of Boeotia in August. There, Agesilaus learned the news that the Spartan fleet was defeated near Cnidus, and that the admiral Pysandrus, his brother-in-law, had died. At the same time, a partial eclipse of the sun occurred, which has helped us with dating. Agesilaus was distressed by the concurrence of these two events, and knowing that his troops would be too, he decided to hide the truth from them, since their loyalty in adversity could not be trusted. Therefore, he announced that, although Pysandros had died, the naval battle was a Spartan victory. He then came forth with a garland on his head and sacrificed as if they were celebrating a victory, and sent around portions of the meat to his troops. With morale at its highest, Agesilaus believed his troops were ready for anything that the Boeotians would throw at them, and they did not disappoint. In the forthcoming Battle of Coronea, Xenophon himself took part in the fighting, and describes it as a battle unlike anything else in his time. Frustratingly, he provides very little in the way of specifics. Most notably, he gives no figures for the armies, just that the Spartans were not outnumbered. He says that both sides had the same number of cavalry, but that Agesilaus had considerably more peltasts. The cavalry numbers are not given, but a modest force of 1,000 to 1,500 is a realistic figure for both armies. He doesn't mention anything about the infantry, but logic would dictate that the Boeotians had to have more hoplites, if they were outnumbered by peltasts, in order to have similar overall figures for both sides. As far as hoplites, we know that Agesilaus commanded the 2,000 Neodamodes who had campaigned with him, a Spartan Mora, or regiment that had crossed over from the Corinthian Gulf, and a half Mora, which was stationed at nearby Orchomenos. A Mora was roughly 1,000, and was not just made up of Spartiates, but also Perioikoi, and quite possibly more freed Helots. So 1.5 Mora plus 2,000 Neodamodes would have given him around 3,500. In addition, the Ionian, Aeolian, and Hellespontine contingents, and the remnants of the 10,000 mercenaries were commanded by Euripides, as we know that they had around 8,000 when they joined Thibron's army. Depending on the desertion rate, this could be anywhere between that and 5,000. Finally, some hoplites were deployed from the local Phocians and Orchomenians. The overall hoplite force, then, may have numbered somewhere around 15,000. Facing them were the Boeotians, Athenians, Corinthians, Argives, Aenianians, Euboeans, and Locrians. The Boeotians and Athenians each likely sent a contingent of 5,000 to 6,000, which was similar to the force that they sent to Nemea. Thrasybulus may have led the Athenians once more. The Euboeans also resided nearby, so they may have sent a strong force of their own, around 3,000. But forces from Argos and Corinth are harder to judge. Between them, they had sent 10,000 to Nemea, but that battle was fought in close proximity to their own lands, and so it cannot be assumed that they chose to send such a strong army so far away from the Peloponnesus. It's possible that their numbers were smaller, and that the Aenianians and Locrians were meant to supplement them somewhat, giving the entire hoplite strength at about 20,000. Both armies would have had a large force of light-armed troops and peltasts. However, because we know that Agesilaus had considerably more peltasts, combined with the fact that we know that he was not outnumbered, it raises the question of just how many light-armed troops did he have. These estimations would give the Boeotian allies a force of around 21,500 hoplites and horses, and an unknown number of light-armed troops. If the Spartans had a force nearing 16,500 with horsemen, Agesilaus would have needed an additional 5,000 peltasts, skirmishers, slingers, and archers, more than the Boeotians. As Agesilaus and his troops advanced southwest from the Cephissus River, the Boeotians marched northeast from Mount Helicon. The two came together in the plain of Coronea, to the west of the actual city. Coronea was one of those places in Greece where several battles were fought, including a previous engagement between the Thebans and the Athenians during the so-called First Peloponnesian War, since it had a flat and relatively confined plain, as a relatively narrow strip of land, that was located on a strategic route between Mount Helicon in the south and Lake Copas in the north. Unfortunately, the strategic importance of Coronea is difficult to visualize today, but it was an important choke point in antiquity, when much of Boeotia was covered by Lake Copas, a large but shallow lake famous for its eels. However, in the early 20th century, the lake was fully drained to allow for more agricultural production. Now, the Cephissus River continues on past Coronea, whereas in antiquity, the river ended in the lake before crossing the plain where the battle was fought. And so today, some imagination is required to picture this plain, which is now many kilometers across, as a strategic pass where two armies would collide. In any case, Agesilaus personally led the right wing of the Spartans themselves. Euripides manned the center, with their Asiatic Greek allies and battle-hardened mercenary veterans, including Xenophon. And the Orchomenians, who were fighting only 20 or so kilometers, or 12 miles, from Orchomenos itself, held the left. On the other hand, the Thebans took up the right, while the Argives held the left opposite of Agesilaus. It's not specified where the rest of the allies were placed for each side, but they were somewhere in the middle. Xenophon records that as both armies marched slowly toward each other across the plain, an eerie silence filled the air. When they were about 500 feet apart, the Thebans raised their war cry, the Paeon, and charged. Agesilaus' men did not react, but continued their march. When there were just about 250 feet between them, his army finally acted. In the center, Euripides led the countercharge with his mercenaries and Asian Greek allies, who dashed out in front of the main phalanx. Agesilaus' forces on the right lingered back, creating a ripple within the ranks, possibly in order for the strongest contingent to join the fray last and cause the greatest impact. However, this sudden attack, which was so unusual for Spartan armies, utterly perplexed the soldiers in the allied center, who turned and ran as soon as shields clashed with spears. The Argives on the allied left fared even worse, as they fled from Agesilaus and the Spartiates opposite them before contact was even made. With their side of the field won with minimal bloodshed, some of the mercenaries were already crowning Agesilaus with the victor's garland, when reports came that the Thebans on the allied right had soundly routed the Orchomenians in front of them, and were now plundering the Spartan baggage train, which was no doubt full of many unbefore-seen treasures that Agesilaus had plundered from Asia. And so, Agesilaus wheeled his phalanx around to face the Theban position, either turning to the left or by performing a complete about-face. So far, the battle had gone like so many hoplite battles had before. The right wings of both sides had easily defeated the left of the other, leaving the enemy right wings to duke it out. At this point, however, the Battle of Coronea took on an entirely different character, one that forced Xenophon to consider it the standalone and defining struggle of the early 4th century BC. What Agesilaus decided to do next was, according to Xenophon, certainly courageous, but by no means safe, as he then led his hoplite phalanx against the Thebans, forcing them to fight through his men head-on if they wished to join their allies in fleeing back to Mount Helicon. Plutarch, offering moral lessons to his readers from the characters of history, says that Agesilaus was carried away by a lust for conquest and by thumos, a word meaning something like passion or fire. When the plundering Thebans saw that the Spartans were approaching them, they drew their lines together in a solid formation and marched forward boldly. In a strange error of judgment, Agesilaus decided against the more logical tactical decision, posited by Xenophon, of allowing the Thebans to pass through before falling upon them from the sides and rear. This was the tactic employed by the victorious Spartan wing at the Nemea River just weeks earlier. Instead, Agesilaus likely let his hatred of the Thebans get the best of him, and he opted to lead his men to plow into the Theban line. Perhaps this characterization is a bit unfair to Agesilaus. Perhaps he realized that Thebes was now clearly the power that Sparta had to reckon with, and if he could kill a large number of their best hoplites, and thus teach them a lesson, they would pose much less of a threat in the future. In any case, the two armies then marched against each other, either in a direction perpendicular to the original battle line, with the Spartans in the west and the Thebans in the east, or the complete reverse of the initial clash, with the Spartans in the south and the Thebans in the north. As the two armies came face to face, in Xenophon's words, their shields clashed together, pushing one together as they attempted to find space in the melee. Spears splintered and shattered, replaced quickly by swords, as the ordered combat of the phalanx descended into the chaos of a brawl. Many Thebans broke through the Spartan ranks and escaped, but others were not so lucky. Xenophon laconically described the fight, quote, crashing together their shields. They shoved, they fought, they killed, they were killed, end quote. For Xenophon, a lifelong soldier writing for others who likely had experience with battle, these few words were enough to convey the bloody fight. He adds only the chilling detail that there were neither shouts nor total silence, but only the strange sound that wrath and battle together produce. Plutarch adds some descriptive elements, especially regarding the valor and competence of the Thebans. According to him, the Theban hoplites fought vigorously and well, and Agesilaus was saved only by the dedication of his hand-picked bodyguard, a unit that Xenophon does not mention. Despite their bravery, Agesilaus was still struck and wounded numerous times by a variety of different weapons, and had to be carried off the battlefield by some of his horsemen. In the end, the Thebans managed to get through the Spartan phalanx, either because the Spartans opened ranks to let them through, as Diodorus and Plutarch say, which is unlikely, or because they broke through the old-fashioned way. Either way, the Theban survivors made it to the safety of Mount Helicon, where they joined their allies. Xenophon's personal purview of the battlefield speaks to the carnage that this battle had brought. While surveying its aftermath, he says that the blood-stained earth served as a macabre bed on which lie the intertwined corpses of both friend and foe. Shields lay shattered on the floor. Pieces of spears and bare daggers littered the area on the ground, sticking from bodies, and some were still clasped in the hands of fallen men. It was a horrific sight that stayed with Xenophon for the rest of his life, and his description highlights just how vivid a scene it must have been to make such a lasting impression on an experienced warrior as he was. Xenophon, though, doesn't give specifics, and so Diodorus is our only source for the battle's casualties. He claims that the Boeotians and their allies lost 600 men, while 350 died on the Spartan side. Needless to say, both sides must have suffered heavy wounds too. Not only swords and spears were used, but also arrows, javelins, and stones, because the light-armed contingents did participate in the combat. After the battle, even as night was approaching, a wounded Agesilaus would not retire to his tent until he was carried back to the front lines and ensured that the dead had been collected. At one point, he also received word that 80 fully armed Theban soldiers had taken refuge in a nearby temple of Athena Etonia, so named because the cult had originated in the Thessalian town of Eton. When asked what he should do, instead of seeking revenge for his wounds, he piously ordered his men not to touch them and allowed them to depart. He even ordered his own personal mounted guards to go and escort them to safety. The next morning, he wished to try the Thebans again and see whether they would offer up another battle. So he ordered Gillas, one of his Spartiate commanders, to deploy the troops into their battle order, erect a victory trophy on the site, place garlands around the necks of every man in honor of the gods, and to have all of the pipe players playing their music in unison. While these orders were playing out, the Thebans did not offer battle, but only sought permission to take up the bodies of their dead for burial under a truce. Although the Spartans technically were the victors at Coronea, it was a symbolic victory at best. Sure, the Quadruple Alliance had been defeated, but Thebes' own contingent had not been, and what is more, they had successfully broken through the enemy's lines, not once, but twice, wounding Agesilaus in the process, a feat with which they were overjoyed, gaining a new confidence in their abilities, as Plutarch emphasizes, but Xenophon ignores. Even more, Coronea proved a strategic victory for the Thebans, as they were nearly as strong afterwards as they were before, and the Spartans were somewhat weaker. As Xenophon would see in his lifetime, this was far from the last time that the Spartans and the Thebans came face to face on the field of battle. At Coronea, the Thebans gave the Spartans a preview of what was to come. In later decades, Theban hoplites would learn how to defeat the Spartans at their own game. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, the Spartans still held the upper hand. Agesilaus, though, did not attempt to follow up the victory with a sweep through Boeotia, something that we might have expected if the victory had any real strategic impact. Instead, Agesilaus went to Delphi, where the Pythian Games were in progress. There, he celebrated the customary procession in honor of Apollo, and dedicated a tenth of the spoils that he had brought from Asia, a dedication which Xenophon reports amounted to no less than 100 talents, an immense sum. He did not return to Theban lands, though. In his absence, Gillas was put in command, and he departed north for Phocis, and from there, invaded neighboring Locris. They plundered the Locrian countryside at will for the whole day, but towards evening, the Locrians began to harass the Spartans in the rear with missiles and javelins. When the Spartans turned, pursued, and struck some of them down, they changed tactics and instead pelted them from higher ground. Some of the Spartans tried to go after them up the hills, but then darkness came and confusion set in as they couldn't see in front of them on the uneven terrain. Some began to stumble and fall, while others could not stand up to the constant missile barrage overhead. In this confusion, 18 Spartiates died, including Gillas, who was struck and killed by a missile. Xenophon says that the whole lot may have perished if it were not for the rest of the Spartiates coming to their assistance. Afterwards, the army was disbanded, and the men each returned to their own cities. Agesilaus was only able to return with his troops to the Peloponnesus by sailing across the Gulf of Corinth, because the Quadruple Alliance still controlled the isthmus. When Agesilaus finally returned to Sparta, Plutarch, who loves to moralize, records that he was one of the few generals who went off to Asia and came back the same person. He showed no taste for Eastern fashions or customs and continued to adhere to the sparse Spartan lifestyle. Even still, Agesilaus always made sure to reward those close to him, and there are numerous anecdotes throughout Plutarch's account detailing how the man was strict when it came to authority and justice, but also showed nepotism and favoritism to his family and friends, not only in getting them out of legal problems, but also in giving them postings and assignments over other more qualified candidates. In addition, as we discussed in episode 110, the presence of Xenophon in Agesilaus' army against the Athenians at the Battle of Coronea could have been what led him to be formally exiled from Athens on the charge of Laconism, meaning that he was pro-Spartan. In any case, it was following this battle that Agesilaus permitted his close friend and admirer Xenophon to move his family to Scyllus and rear his kids in the Spartan agoge, an extraordinary honor rarely given to outsiders, let alone Athenians. It was also during this time, as we mentioned, that Agesilaus supposedly found the personal letters of Lysander, with his intent to start a revolution and change the Spartan government. But ultimately, he was convinced by the ephors to keep it buried with him. As for the other Spartan king, the young Agesilaus, Agesilaus also tried to bring him under his sway. With Lysander and Pausanias gone, and with his influence over the ephors in Gerousia, there was no doubt that he had the most power in Sparta at the time. The end of 394 should have brought with it a reflection on some important tactical military lessons for Sparta. One regarding the danger of facing the densely formed Theban formation, and the other the vulnerability of their soldiers against light-armed troops. But these lessons were either not picked up on, or just as likely, they were ignored. Sure, the Spartans had won 2 land battles at Nemea and Coronea, but these military successes were of little consequence, as they had done nothing to relieve the Spartans' very precarious position. Within the war's first year, Sparta had suffered a massive reversal of fortune. They had lost their naval empire in the Aegean and on the coast of Asia Minor. Except for Phocis and Orchomenus, they had lost control of central and northern Greece. And far more worryingly, their supremacy in the Peloponnesus, which underpinned their status as a superpower, was under threat from a coalition that included their 2 strongest former allies, Thebes and Corinth, and their deadliest enemies, Argos and Athens. Furthermore, they were now trapped in the Peloponnesus due to their enemy's strategy, which was designed to bottle them up there. In doing so, the Quadruple Alliance's forces had occupied the territory of Corinth, which stretched between the Corinthian and Saronic Gulfs at the Isthmus, and had built long walls from Corinth to its western port, Lycaon, and to its eastern port, Cenchreae. As a result, for the Spartans, unless these fortifications were captured, there would be no land passage from the Peloponnesus through the Isthmus to central Greece and beyond. The position of the Spartans in the Peloponnesus was further weakened by Conon and Pharnabazus. They had already forced Agesilaus from Asia, destroyed the Spartan fleet, driven the Spartan harmosts and garrisons out of the eastern Aegean, and penned Dercylidus in the Hellespont. The following spring, they wished to take the next logical step. That is to shift the war to the southwest Aegean by bringing it to Spartan territory. By doing so, they would force the Spartans to concentrate their efforts on defending their homeland, and thus pin them down further in the Peloponnesus. Then, they could subdue and isolate Dercylidus in the Hellespont. So, having gathered a large fleet and numerous mercenaries, in the spring of 393 BC, Pharnabazus and Conon first sailed to the Spartan colony of Melos, the southwesternmost island in the Cyclades, and established a base there for operations in the western Aegean. This was the first time since the Persian Wars that a Persian fleet had gone this far west. The military occupation by these pro-Athenian forces led to several democratic revolutions and new alliances with Athens in the eastern Aegean islands of Kos, Nisrius, Chios, Lesbos, and those of the Cyclades. With this completed, the fleet proceeded west to Greece itself in order to take revenge on the Spartans. They first raided the coast of Laconia at various places, including Pherae, but soon they became fearful of its lack of harbors, the prospect of help coming from the Spartans, and the scarcity of provisions in the area, so they turned about and sailed for the island of Cythera, to the southeast. There, its inhabitants quickly surrendered on the condition that they were allowed to depart under a truce to Laconia. With Cythera a Persian possession now, they established a garrison with an Athenian named Nicophemos as its harmost, who was obviously appointed to remove any hint of Persian designs on Greek land. Feelings of great panic arose among the Spartans, who feared that the garrison would provoke a Helot uprising. After all, just 6 years earlier almost took place the conspiracy of Kynodon, as relayed in the last episode. Strategically, Pharnabazus and Conon now commanded the southern Aegean, and more importantly, controlled the sea lanes from Sicily, allowing them to hinder any Syracusan naval reinforcement of the Spartans in the Aegean. Furthermore, possession of Cythera also had the dual effect of directly threatening Taenarun, the harbor of Sparta, and of cutting the strategic route between the Peloponnesus and Egypt, and thus avoiding Spartan-Egyptian collaboration. After leaving part of their fleet at Cythera, Pharnabazus and Conon sailed to Corinth. No matter the circumstances, it must have been strange for the Greeks to see a Persian satrap on their lands. At the Isthmus, in the sanctuary of Poseidon, where the council was meeting, Conon played the role of an invaluable diplomat who was trusted to speak both for the Persians and for the Greeks. He urged the Quadruple Alliance to remain faithful to the Persian king, a delicate way of avoiding the word alliance, but meaning much the same thing in practice. The allies agreed and pledged their fidelity. By so doing, they also acknowledged that the Greeks of Asia Minor belonged to the Persian king, and that those in the Aegean were to be autonomous. Neither stipulation was a serious concern of the Thebans, Argives, Corinthians, and Athenians. Their main focus for the time being was defeating Sparta, and so they agreed to joint action with the Persians simply because it was mutually advantageous. In return, Pharnabazus gave them money to carry on the war against the Spartans. The amount is unknown, but it was presumably considerable. They were to use it to continue land and naval warfare around Corinth, which again was also beneficial to Pharnabazus because it would distract the Spartans in Greece and keep them out of Asia. Confident that he had caused Sparta enough of a headache, Pharnabazus then sailed back to his satrapy. But before he left, he passed official control over the Persian fleet to Conon, so that he could use it to continue the fight against the Spartans. Pharnabazus also provided Conon with 50 talents to give towards the Athenians' efforts of refortifying the Piraeus. The satrap felt no friendship for Athens. He meant simply to punish Sparta. As Conon had said to him, quote, "I can think of no action that would hurt the Spartans more. By doing so, you will not only have given the Athenians something for which they will be grateful, but will really have made the Spartans suffer. You will make null and void that achievement of theirs, which cost them more toil and trouble than anything else." End quote. Of course, he is referring to the outcome that they achieved after 27 years of the Peloponnesian War. However, the ultimate goals of Pharnabazus and Conon would soon diverge. Whereas Pharnabazus wanted to destroy Spartan power in the Aegean by using Conon as his instrument, Conon secretly strove to use Persian money and resources to restore Athenian security and naval power. It's likely, though, that Pharnabazus had realized that this might cause a future problem in the Aegean, but that in the short term, it was a necessary byproduct in order to cripple the Spartan war effort. After all, he was familiar with the craftiness of Alcibiades, and so he likely treated Conon as he had once treated the rogue Athenian. If at some point he wished to shift his support back to the Spartans, then he could rely upon his cordial relations with Agesilaus. Therefore, Pharnabazus was likely trying to play a complex and subtle game of his own by supporting whoever most benefited him at that particular moment. At some point, Conon also established a mercenary force of light armed troops, which would remain in Corinth under his own control before he passed it to the command of the Athenian general Iphicrates. These light armed troops, not hoplites, but people without hoplite armor and shields, either threw missiles and spears or shot arrows. But Iphicrates began to train them as a professional force so that they could move swiftly and together as a body in such a way as to be just as effective, even against a hoplite phalanx. We will discuss this mercenary force under Iphicrates a lot in the future narrative. In any case, with his work at Corinth done, Conon sailed his 80 triremes the short distance back to Athens for the first time in about a decade. When he arrived at the Piraeus, he had with him enough money for the Athenians to finish rebuilding their long walls. The Athenians, months earlier, had already begun this process, thanks to a project initiated by Thrasybulus. But with the help of Conon's men and Persian money, they were able to pay for enough stone, timber, masons, and carpenters, and build it at a much faster pace so that its construction was soon completed. These actions meant that some of the main consequences of the Peloponnesian War had now been undone. The Athenians once again were a walled city, with long walls connecting Athens to a walled port at the Piraeus. In other words, the basis for having an independent naval policy was now in place, thanks to Conon. On top of that, Conon handed over the Persian fleet of 80 triremes to the Athenians. And so, just like that, the Athenians again had the biggest fleet in the Greek world. In order to celebrate the restoration of the Piraeus, the ecclesia honored Themistocles, whose descendants had long ago brought his ashes back from Asia, with a tomb, an altar, and a pillar on a plot of land just outside the Cantharos harbor, the western of the Piraeus' 3 harbors. The other 2 were Zea and Munichia in the east. With the raising of this monument to the founder of their navy and the hero of Salamis, the Athenians formally rededicated themselves to the quest for victory at sea. Although the victory at Cnidus was technically a Persian one, Athens also honored Conon with a statue. In return, with his own money, Conon either built a new one or adorned a temple for Aphrodite in the Piraeus. As the goddess of Cnidus, she was dear to his heart, and it was as Aphrodite Euploia, or Aphrodite of the Fair Voyage, that he and his fellow Athenians now worshipped her here. Although Thrasybulus had regained his preeminence in Athenian politics, the 2 defeats at Nemea and Coronea, in which he likely led the Athenian contingent, seemed to have damaged his political stature some. Combined with Conon's blossoming reputation at the moment, it seems that once again he was replaced as the de facto head of the state and leader of the Athenian fleet. Conon very clearly was the man of the hour. At the same time, not all Athenians were happy about the resurrection of Athenian naval power. The philosopher Plato, in his Laws, told his students that the walls should continue to slumber in the bosom of the earth. And in Aristophanes' comedic play, Assemblywomen, which we will discuss in a future episode, the chorus of Athenian matrons noted the difficulty of dealing with a public opinion divided against itself. They observed that the mass of citizens voted for new ships, but the farmers and the rich opposed them. In the real-life assembly, Conon warned the Athenians to be satisfied with getting back their freedom and their walls. As Conon reminded them, the imperialistic plans advocated by Thrasybulus came from a man whose very name meant rash advisor. Even still, Conon must have known that once the Athenians had back their walls and a fleet, their thirst for empire would soon follow. Conan's visit also spurred increased activity in Athenian foreign affairs. They had already granted citizenship to Evagrius, but now they awarded him with a statue that was erected near that of Conan in the Piraeus. Fragments of the decree for Evagrius' statue portray him as a Greek fighting for the freedom and autonomy of all of the Greeks. At the same time, the Athenians sent an embassy led by Epicrates and Formisus to Artaxerxes. Little is known of Formisus, but Epicrates was one of the democratic politicians who had entertained Timocrates and perhaps took Persian money before the start of the war. While the specific purpose of their mission is not mentioned, it likely was to ensure Athenian good faith. Furthermore, with Conan around, the Athenians took advantage of their new position to regain those islands that were crucial to them as the stepping stones to the Hellespont by seizing Lemnos, Imbros, and Skyros, and reestablishing Clerugia on them, as well as the sacred island of Apollo at Delos. They also made an alliance with the important island of Chios. And so they now had the bare beginnings in the reconstruction of their old naval alliance. However, even though they would become far more powerful in years to come, they were never able to recreate their old empire of the 5th century BC. Perhaps because their silver mines were no longer producing at the same level. And so, instead of being the supreme power of Greece, they were only peers to the likes of Thebes, Corinth, Argos, and Sparta. Still, Athens regained their position as a major power in Greece, became a force again in international politics, and ensured that Sparta would be prevented from taking it over. Meanwhile, when the Corinthians had finished fitting out a new squadron of ships with Pharnabazus' money, they appointed Agathinos at first, and then Proanos to command them, and these two men used the ships to maintain control in the Corinthian Gulf, around the harbor of Lechaon and the Achaean coastline. The Spartans in turn also fitted out ships and named Podanemus as their commander, and Polus as vice-admiral. However, when Podanemus was killed and Polus was wounded in some unspecified attack, command of these ships temporarily fell to Eurypides, until Teleucus, the half-brother of Agesilaus, was able to take over. Under Teleucus, the Spartans were able to wrestle back control of the Corinthian Gulf from the Corinthians. Further to the north, in the early years of the 4th century BC, Olynthos, the largest Greek city on the Thracian coast in the Chalkidiki Peninsula, had begun to create a league with some other surrounding cities, the details of which remain largely unknown. In this so-called Chalkidian League, the Olynthians instituted isopoliteia with their nearest neighbors, which meant that they shared the same laws and rights of citizenship. Larger cities also later joined the league. At the outbreak of the Korinthian War, the Chalkidian League had joined the allies against Sparta, but had taken no active part in the actual fighting. The Olynthians instead devoted their ambition and energy to their own region. Around 391 or 390 BC, Olynthian power received a significant boost when the Macedonian king Amyntas III, a year after expelling the Illyrians and returning to the throne, secured his eastern flank for the time being by concluding a 50-year treaty with the Chalkidian League. Part of the text of this treaty was found on a stone at Olynthus. There is talk of a military alliance, and rules are established for the export of timber, a strategic raw material, the export of which was previously under the control of Macedon. From now on, the Chalkidians were allowed to freely export resin and wood to build ships, and only when exporting spruce was it necessary for them to obtain permission from the Macedonian king and pay duties. In the political part of the agreement, the treaty prohibited both parties from establishing friendships with Amphipolis, Batiaia, and Canthos or Mende without mutual agreement. The main points of the treaty were in the interests of Olynthus, who, in addition to unheard of trade privileges, achieved the isolation of their rivals in the region. Over the next few years, the economic and political position of the Chalkidian League continued to strengthen, while Macedon remained very vulnerable. Needless to say, the growing power of Olynthus and the Chalkidian League will be something that we will return to later. Back in southern Greece, the events following the battles of Nemea, Coronea, and Cnidus left the Spartans with a slight upper hand on land, but a severe weakness at sea. The coalition states had been unable to defeat the Spartan phalanx in the field, but had kept their alliance strong and prevented the Spartans from moving at will through central Greece. Both sides settled down to a war of slow attrition marked by skirmishes, raids, and diplomatic positioning, during a period of stalemate in which neither side could land a decisive blow on the other. The Spartans would continue to attempt, over the next several years, to knock either Corinth or Argos out of the war. Meanwhile, the anti-Spartan allies sought to preserve their united front against Sparta, while Athens and Thebes took advantage of Sparta's preoccupation to enhance their own power in areas that they had traditionally dominated. For the rest of the war, neither side could get past the isthmus, so the bulk of the fighting surrounded the city of Corinth. Both sides stayed bunkered down in their bases, the allies in Corinth and the Spartans roughly 10 miles to the northwest in Sicyon. The combat was minimal, consisting of raids and skirmishes. In fact, neither side was particularly troubled, except for the Corinthian people themselves. Since the end of their tyranny in the 6th century BC, Corinth had been a broad oligarchic government and had been untouched. But at some point in 393 BC, there arose a topsy-turvy situation politically in Corinth. It was their land that was being ravaged, their crops that couldn't be harvested, their poverty, and their citizens that were being made casualties. But their grievances were not solely pointed towards the Spartans, but also at their allies, who chose to make Corinth their base. And as a result, their allies' land was untouched, and they could live in peace and enjoy the produce of their lands undisturbed, all while leaving Corinth to suffer in the name of freedom. That became a problem in a way that it had never been before, and produced an anti-war faction amongst its wealthier citizens, whom Xenophon calls the majority and the best. These were the rich oligarchs who owned the most fertile land between Sicyon and Corinth. Though powerful, they formed a minority. By this point, the Spartans had left untouched the rest of the Corinthia. Small landholders elsewhere cultivated their lands unhindered. The war had not yet endangered their livelihoods, nor had others of the oligarchy suffered considerably. Commerce, not agriculture, was the basis of Corinthian prosperity, and no Spartan campaign to date had damaged trade. The only damage that was being felt was by the land-owning Corinthians. So they began to gather together to advocate for peace and the end of Corinth's sufferings. Rumors of Corinth's most influential citizens advocating for peace finally reached the ears of those other Corinthian oligarchs who had taken bribes from the king and who were the ones most responsible for the war. And so this was a contest between two oligarchical groups, and the question of the view of the common people was of no consequence. The pro-war Corinthians quickly realized that unless they did away with those who were supporting peace, there was a danger that the whole city might ally itself again with Sparta, which would most likely result in their exile, or worse, their deaths. So for this reason, they engineered a plot to murder the anti-war leaders, and they planned to use the cover of a religious festival to achieve it. They had apparently enlisted the help of some Argives too. The festival was that of Artemis Euclia, or Artemis of the Glory, and they chose its last day when they thought that they could capture the most men in the Agora. So upon a given signal, the conspirators unsheathed their swords and struck their selected victims. The purge was frighteningly efficient. They attacked one man who was standing among a circle of his friends. Another was slain while seated. Someone else was killed in the theater, and they even struck down one who was sitting as a judge. When the people began to realize the horror that was unfolding in front of them, they descended into a panicked mob. The quote-unquote best men among them, knowing that they were the targets of this attack, took flight towards the statues and altars of the gods in the Agora for a safe haven. But this didn't stop the conspirators, who impiously slayed these unfortunate men and left them in pools of their own blood, as Xenophon notes. It should also be noted that the extra stress Xenophon places upon these sacrilegious acts is a little suspect. Diodorus gives a simpler and less vivid account of the same event, without all the impious details, which may or may not be hyperbole in Xenophon. In any case, 120 men were killed, most of which were older members of the anti-war faction. That's because the younger men had not been in the Agora thanks to a Corinthian officer named Passamellus, who had suspected that something fishy was going to happen. So he had them congregate at Cranion, a grove of cypress trees in front of the city, which likely served as a gymnasion. While Xenophon does not describe it as a gymnasion, it is most likely that there was one, because there was a famous one there in later centuries, as described by Pausanias, and a gymnasion would be a logical place for the young and best of Corinthian men to spend time. In any case, when they heard the outcry and saw those fleeing the massacre, the young men quickly ran for the safety of the Acrocorinth, a very steep and very high hill that overlooked the city of Corinth. Its desirability to be used as a place of defensive resistance is highlighted by the fact that in order for these young men to get there from Cranion, they would have to run through the city, north to south, past the agora and the theater, fighting off any attacks from the conspirators along the way. At the Temple of Aphrodite, on the summit of the Acrocorinth, while they were deliberating about what they should do next, a capital fell from one of its columns, without being touched by man, earthquake, or wind. Likewise, when they sacrificed to the goddess, the omens from the victims were such that the seer interpreted it to mean that they were not secure there, and that they better flee down from the citadel before it was too late. Since they knew that Corinth was no longer safe, they fled into a self-imposed exile. Diodorus gives their number as 500. With the Corinthians on the verge of civil war, the Argives took up arms in full force and marched against Corinth. After seizing the Acropolis, they secured the city for themselves, so that Corinth was now considered Argive territory. The Athenian commander Iphicrates also had designs to seize the city, but he relented when the people opposed it. At least this is what Diodorus reports. Everything that happened afterwards could very well have been voluntary, and not one polis forcing themselves on another. In any case, with the anti-war faction succinctly dealt with, the conspirators entered into a special union between the cities of Corinth and Argos, called a Sympoliteia, which can be literally translated as joint citizenship. It was a political unification, but not one that involved the physical relocation of either or both cities. Instead, both cities arranged for a new situation where citizens of one state would also be citizens of the other. There was a common citizenship so that the Corinthians were now Argives, and that the Argives were now Corinthians. So theoretically, if one lived in Corinth and wanted to travel to Argos to sit in on the Argive assembly, he could do it, and vice versa. This is something absolutely new in the Greek world. This new state dominated the northeastern Peloponnesus and controlled the isthmus' southern portion. If this new state had endured, it might have profoundly affected political developments in Greece. But this one hardly lasted at all, just a few years as a consequence of the war, and was undone at the war's end. Nevertheless, it's an indication of what people were thinking about politically. And in the course of the 4th century BC, there were several federations of 2 or more polis that were something different, but similar. These were called isopoliteia, or an equality of political rights, in which equal citizenship was granted to the citizens of the participating polis. But each polis still maintained its political independence, and so there wasn't an outright merger. This is something that we just saw with the aforementioned Halkidian League. However, ancient writers use the two terms Sympoliteia and Isopoliteia loosely sometimes, which can add to our confusion of how these political organizations worked in practice. At some point a bit later, those in power back in the city of Corinth gave word to those young men in a self-imposed exile that if they returned home, they would suffer no harm. Some returned, but they did so to a home that had changed, and so they found the current affairs in Corinth to be unbearable, because the agreement with Argos brought with it an influx of Argives who now had citizenship. It also saw the removal of the boundary stones of Corinth, and it was even believed that the leaders were acting like tyrants. Therefore, to them, the city had lost its identity and its way. They wished for Corinth to be separate and independent again, instead of united with Argos. So some decided to overthrow the current regime. It would be a win-win. Either they would become saviors of their city, or they would die honorably in the attempt. With this in mind, 2 men, one being the aforementioned Passamellus, and the other named Alcamenes, were chosen for the job. They avoided detection as they snuck out of the city and met with Praxiteles, the Spartan Polemarchus, who happened to be on garrison duty with his regiment at Sicyon. They told him that they could give him entrance to Corinth's long walls, which stretched from the city up to its northern port of Lycaon. The long walls flanked either side of the road that ran to the port and kept this lifeline secure in case of sieges. By offering entrance to these walls, the men were offering Sparta a way to starve Corinth and all of its citizens. An offer of such a brazen betrayal apparently didn't raise any suspicions from Praxiteles, because he knew these men and considered them trustworthy. So he began to make the necessary arrangements. His forces were put on alert, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. The opportunity arrived on the night that Passamellus and Alcamenes were both assigned to guard one of the gates along the wall that faced towards Sicyon. In the darkness of night, Praxiteles arrived at the head of a full Spartan regiment with a complementary contingent of Sicyonian troops and 150 Corinthian exiles. He first ensured that no traps were being laid, so he chose one of his most trusted men to run reconnaissance. This man was subsequently given a quick tour of the interior by Passamellus and Alcamenes. When he returned and confirmed that everything was good to go, Praxiteles gave the order for his troops to enter the western wall through the opened gate. With the port of Lycaon at his back, Praxiteles quickly assessed the situation. Scant remains of the two parallel walls suggest that the space between them was about 1,300 meters, or 3/4 of a mile. Due to such a wide gap, Praxiteles found that his numbers were too few to create a battle line that stretched its entire length and anchored both flanks on each of the two walls, and so one of them, at least, would be dangerously unprotected if they advanced. Therefore, this fact forced him to seemingly introduce revolutionary tactics into Greek warfare by fortifying their position on the battlefield. In doing so, he had his men establish a palisaded camp as they waited for reinforcements. They dug a trench across the width of the walls and used the excavated soil to build a rampart behind the ditch. Their position was by no means secure, though, as there was a hostile garrison of Boeotians stationed behind them at the port of Lycaon. Amazingly, the Spartan position was not challenged for the entire first day. While the Corinthians should not have been expected to launch a frontal attack against the Spartans without allied reinforcements, it is still surprising that we do not hear of any skirmishes or even any military posturing. Corinth did have a force of peltasts under Iphicrates, who could realistically have caused some damage to the Spartans during this wait, if only to their morale. In any case, when the Argives did arrive the following day to bring assistance, the Corinthians in the city finally moved against the defensive position of Praxiteles. They lined up their forces with the peltast mercenaries under Iphicrates on the right, by the eastern wall, the Argive hoplites in the center, and the Corinthian hoplites on the left, by the western wall. For the sake of clarity, by Argive here, I mean those who came from Argos, and by Corinthian, those who came from Corinth, though technically, with the new Sympaleteia, their designators are interchangeable. Furthermore, we are not given their numbers, so all figures are speculative. One thing for certain is that the Spartans were at a numerical disadvantage. It seems likely that the allied army numbered somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000, while the Spartans possibly had around 2,000. In terms of the battle line, which was thinly stretched behind their barricade, Praxiteles and his Spartans were in their customary position on the right wing, by the western wall, with the Sicyonians in the center, and the Corinthian exiles holding the left, by the eastern wall. A small Spartan cavalry force, led by Passimachus, was also there in the rear, as a sort of reserve force. As the battle began, the Corinthians saw that they held a huge numerical advantage, and rather brashly and overconfidently, they charged towards the siege works. Those on the right wing of the Corinthians squared off against the Spartans, but they had not stretched out their line all the way to the wall as the Spartans had done, with the result that the leftmost lines of the Corinthians struck the easier target of the Sicyonians, who were deployed to the left of the Spartans. And so the Corinthians routed them and shattered their stockade, causing many to flee north to the sea. Crossing the ditch, the bulk of the Corinthians chased after them and massacred many Sicyonians by the shoreline. When Pasimachus, the Spartan cavalry commander, saw that the Sicyonians were being hard-pressed, he ordered his men to tie their horses to trees, to pick up any dropped shields of the Sicyonians, and to follow his lead. Rather than move to support those by the shoreline, though, he foolishly tried to exploit the gap that was left by the Corinthians in their pursuit. They were spotted by the Argives, and the fighting was fierce. But his vastly outnumbered contingent eventually was overwhelmed, and many were killed, including Pasimachus himself. The Corinthian exiles, though, had much greater success against the light-armed peltast mercenaries of Iphicrates, who had been hamstrung by the confined spaces that restricted their greatest asset of mobility. So the exiles slipped through and advanced away from the harbor towards the city itself. Unfortunately, the fighting with the Spartans is not described in any of our sources, which seem to ignore the remaining Corinthians almost entirely in the narrative, and the Spartans are left doing nothing, which seems highly unlikely. One explanation for the disappearance of the Corinthians is that Xenophon wishes to convey the new political reality that there was no real distinction to be made between them and the Argives. So when he uses the term Argives, he is actually referring to both those who came from Argos and those who came from the city of Corinth. And so it's likely that the Spartan forces successfully repelled the remaining Corinthian soldiers, and that they then joined together into one huge mass, which Xenophon calls the Argives. With the battle lines broken up as they were, Praxiteles had to make a choice on whether he wanted to relieve his Sicyonian allies that were still being slaughtered on the beach to the rear, which would mean forfeiting the battlefield, to take the defensive and hold the stockade on their own, or to take the offensive and press ahead. His decision was made easier when the Argives began to cross the ditch and ramparts, so he wheeled his troops to the left with tactical precision. It should be noted that the text of Xenophon is not clear here, as it describes this action as one to help the Sicyonians, but the description of the stockade remaining on their left-hand side does not make any sense. It is postulated then that the way Praxiteles was going to save his allies was by creating a new front in the battle. Well, when the Argives perceived that the Spartans were moving behind them, they panicked and quickly ran back from the stockade. But as they retreated, their unprotected wing was intercepted and struck by the Spartans. As droves of Argives fell, those on their wing nearest the wall crowded together and began to run towards the city. But when they ran into the Corinthian exiles in front of them, they formed into a trapped, disorganized mob and fled to the steps up the eastern wall. As the Spartans swept through the Argives' other wing, they closed in closer and closer to the eastern wall. At the same time, the Argives were being cut down at the foot of the steps, either by enemy weapons from the Corinthian exiles, or by their own doing, as many were trodden underfoot and suffocated while trying to find some way to escape. Witnessing their inevitable defeat, those who had successfully made it on top of the wall chose to jump to their deaths, preferring to take fate into their own hands, rather than to give the Spartans or the Corinthian traitors any satisfaction. For Praxiteles' men, by the time that they reached the eastern wall, the battle had turned into a mauling. With the field taken, a part of the Spartan army was sent forth to deal with the Boeotian guards at the port of Lake Haon. They didn't put up much of a resistance either. Some fled to the long walls, while others climbed the roofs of the trireme sheds. But all were killed. Like the number of participants, the total number of casualties is not recorded in the sources, but Xenophon does say that so many fell in such a short time that the inhabitants, who were used to seeing heaps of grain, wood, and stones, saw instead on that day heaps of corpses, a vivid image indeed of the carnage. Afterwards, under truce, the Corinthians and the Argives took away all of those heaps of corpses. At some point after the battle, Sparta's allies finally arrived. With these reinforcements, their position was secured. The Battle of Corinth's Long Walls, as it is known, was a resounding victory for the outnumbered Spartans, but they refrained once again from pushing their advantage and taking the city of Corinth. Even still, Praxiteles showed a rare example of a Spartan officer who displayed ingenuity, independence, and initiative in the face of an unexpected but promising opportunity. In doing so, he decided to start taking down a section of Corinth's long walls, so that there would be a wide enough opening to march an army through. This means that the Spartan base at Sicyon could now be regularly reinforced and supplied by both land and sea. And from this secure position, the Spartans could pursue further operations to encircle Corinth. Once this was completed then, he led his army eastward and took control of the towns of Sidus and Crommyon, placing garrisons within both. The strategic importance of Sidus is that it formed a link between Corinth and Crommyon, which itself sat on the coastal road from Attica along the Scaronian cliffs. This route formed the first approach from Megara. And so, by placing 2 garrisons in both of these strong points, there were now 2 considerable obstacles between the Athenians and their Corinthian allies. It also prevented the Athenian ships from landing in the northwestern corner of the Saronic Gulf, in the area between the Megarian port of Nisaea and Corinth's other port at Cancreae. With this work done, Praxiteles returned to Lycaon and then to Sicyon, where he disbanded the army before returning home to Sparta. Even if Sparta could not overwhelm Corinth, thanks to Praxiteles' exploits, they themselves could not easily be dislodged from Sicyon. The war had fallen into a virtual stalemate in the Corinthia. Following Nemea and Coronea, both sides stopped mobilizing large armies of their own citizens, and instead sent garrisons to Corinth and Sicya, and came to rely heavily on mercenaries. Although they came from all over, they were especially prominent from places like Crete, Aetolia, and Acarnania. In particular, a force of light-armed mercenaries, commanded by the Athenian Iphicrates, was especially notable. We've discussed this force and Iphicrates quite a bit already, but it will behoove us to linger on them a bit more. At this point, he was still a junior commander in his mid to late 20s. Despite his young age, he paid special attention to discipline, drill, and maneuvering. Cornelius Nepos mentions that he commanded those under him with such strictness that no other troops in Greece were ever better disciplined or more obedient to the orders of their leader than Iphicrates' troops. He also says that Iphicrates was not only comparable to the best commanders of his own time, but that no one before him could even be set above him. Reverence of one's troops is one thing, but more importantly, Iphicrates gained notoriety for his military successes and the tactical innovations that he made. He had a deep knowledge of military tactics, and early on, he came to recognize the importance of the professional peltast as a pivotal element in Greek warfare. So at some point in the late 390s BC, he began to introduce what would become known as the Iphicratian reforms. Whereas the traditional civilian hoplite was armed with thick bronze armor and carried very large shields, short spears, and small swords, his men were given linen cuirasses and were armed with a smaller and lighter shield known as a pelte. The linen was much lighter, but still protected the body, and was far better suited for the conditions of year-round camp life and the duties of professional soldiers. On the other hand, the pelte helped them be more active and quicker in movements and encounters. His improvements included lengthening the sword and the javelin, and introducing a kind of boot-like leggings that were lighter and could be untied faster and easier. These boots would become known as Iphicratides, from his name. It is difficult to appreciate the full impact of these changes, but they were clearly meant to unite the effectiveness of attack with the rapidity of motion. The longer weapons, combined with the lighter armor and shield, helped his troops not only be more aggressive in tactical situations, but also allowed them to engage in hand-to-hand fighting as part of the main battle line longer than before. In the initial stages of the Corinthian War, the Spartans had won 2 land battles at Nemea and Coronea, but still lost control or influence over most of central and northern Greece. They also lost a sea battle at Cnidus, which resulted in them losing their naval empire in the Aegean and on the coast of Asia Minor. Despite gaining an advantage in Corinthia, they were still essentially trapped in the Peloponnesus. While Thebes and Athens took advantage of their preoccupation to enhance their own power in areas that they had traditionally dominated, the Thebans with their land-based Boeotian League, and the Athenians in reconstructing their naval empire. This was the situation at the beginning of the war's 3rd year. Once again, Persian financial and military backing would have major implications. But for whom? Would the Persians still continue to support the Quadruple Alliance against the Spartans? Or would the growing naval power of Athens once again cause the Persians to side with the Spartans? Find out next time on the History of Ancient Greece, Episode 113, Living on a Persian Prayer, Part 2.